Have you ever wondered what it would be like to wake up trapped in someone else's nightmare? Well, tonight we're going to discover exactly that as we step into the worn leather boots of Margaret Whitmore, a middle-class Victorian woman whose life has become consumed by a substance that was supposed to heal her, but instead became her prison. The year is 1884, and laudanum flows through London's chemist shops as freely as tea flows through its drawing rooms. What I'm going to do is take you through a single day in Margaret's life, showing you how addiction looked when it was perfectly legal, socially acceptable, and prescribed by doctors as a cure for everything from headaches to heartbreak. By the end of this journey, you'll understand how an entire generation of women became unknowing prisoners in their own homes, dependent on a substance that promised relief, but delivered only deeper suffering. But first, let me paint you the world Margaret inhabits, because understanding her addiction means understanding the society that created it. London in the 1880s is a city of contrasts that would make your head spin. Gas lamps flicker against the perpetual fog that rolls off the Thames, while horse-drawn carriages clatter over cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of traffic. The air tastes of coal smoke and carries the constant sound of steam engines, factory whistles, and the cries of street vendors selling everything from hot pies to yesterday's newspapers. For women like Margaret, life exists within carefully defined boundaries. She cannot vote, cannot own property after marriage, and cannot pursue most professions. Her world consists of her home, the local church, occasional visits to respectable shops, and carefully chaperoned social calls. But within these constraints, she was supposed to find fulfillment as wife, mother, and guardian of moral virtue. The problem is that this idealized existence often proved impossible to maintain. The pressures of managing a household, bearing and raising children, and meeting society's impossible standards for feminine perfection created an epidemic of what Victorian doctors called nervous disorders. Women complained of hysteria, neurasthenia, and a dozen other conditions that we might now recognize as depression, anxiety, and the simple exhaustion of living without autonomy or purpose. Enter laudanum, the miracle cure that promised to solve all these problems with just a few drops in a glass of water. Laudanum was liquid opium, mixed with alcohol and flavored with spices to make it palatable. Every chemist sold it, every doctor prescribed it, and every household kept a bottle for emergencies. It was marketed as safe, effective, and morally acceptable because it was medicine rather than recreation. Victorian society, which viewed alcohol consumption by women with suspicion, saw no problem with ladies taking their daily dose of opium-based medicine. Margaret first encountered laudanum 3 years ago when her physician prescribed it for the crushing headaches that began after the birth of her second child. Dr. Thornbury, a respected gentleman with offices in Harley Street, assured her that the medicine was perfectly safe for nursing mothers and would restore her vitality without compromising her maternal duties. The relief was immediate and profound. Not only did her headaches disappear, but the constant anxiety about household management, the exhaustion from sleepless nights with crying babies, and the suffocating sense of being trapped in her life simply melted away. For the first time in months, Margaret felt like herself again, but that feeling required increasingly frequent doses to maintain. Now, let me take you through a typical morning in Margaret's life, because this is where you'll truly understand how laudanum has woven itself into every aspect of her existence. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimes 6 times, but Margaret has been awake for hours. Sleep, when it comes, brings vivid dreams that blur the line between nightmare and memory. Her body aches with a bone-deep discomfort that feels like influenza without the fever. Her hands shake as she reaches for the small brown bottle on her bedside table. The laudanum bottle has become her most precious possession. She knows exactly how many doses remain without counting, can judge the liquid's potency by its color, and has developed elaborate strategies for ensuring she never runs out. Hidden bottles throughout the house serve as backup supplies, secreted behind books, tucked into hat boxes, and concealed in places where even the most thorough housemaid would never look. Margaret measures her morning dose with the precision of a pharmacist. Too little, and the day will be unbearable. Too much, and she risks the stupor that might attract unwanted attention from her husband Charles or the servants. The sweet, bitter liquid burns slightly as it goes down, but within minutes, the transformation begins. The aching in her joints subsides. The tremor in her hands steadies. Most importantly, the crushing weight of reality lifts just enough to make the day seem manageable. She can face the mirror now, seeing a respectable woman rather than the hollow-eyed creature who stared back at her moments before. Her morning routine proceeds with the mechanical precision of someone who has learned to function despite profound internal chaos. She rings for her lady's maid, Mary, who helps her into the elaborate undergarments that Victorian propriety demands. The corset, petticoats and bustle create the silhouette that society expects, but they also serve another purpose for Margaret. The tight lacing and structured garments help hold her together, both literally and figuratively, when the laudanum's effects begin to wane. Mary, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, has begun to notice things. The way Margaret's pupils dilate and contract throughout the day, the slight slur in her speech during certain conversations, the increasing frequency with which she claims to need medicine for various ailments. But Mary also understands the precarious nature of her own position in the household, and she has learned that asking too many questions can lead to unemployment without references. Breakfast presents its own challenges. Margaret must appear at the table at precisely 8 o'clock, looking fresh and capable of managing the day's domestic responsibilities. She must make conversation with Charles about his work at the bank, listen to the children's plans for their lessons, and coordinate with the cook about the day's meals and any social obligations. The laudanum helps her perform this role, but it also creates new complications. Food tastes strange when she's under the influence, often triggering nausea that she must hide behind delicate nibbling and claims of a sensitive constitution. She has learned to push eggs around her plate artfully, to sip tea in a way that suggests appetite without actually consuming much, and to direct conversations toward topics that require minimal mental effort. Charles, absorbed in newspaper reports about colonial affairs and railway investments, rarely notices these subtle deceptions. Like most Victorian men of his class, he has been trained to view his wife's health as a delicate and mysterious thing, best left to the management of doctors and female relatives. Her increasing reliance on medicine strikes him as evidence of feminine fragility rather than cause for concern. The children present a more complex challenge. 8-year-old Edmund and 6-year-old Charlotte possess the natural curiosity and observational skills that adults often lack. They notice when their mother's voice changes, when her movements become either too careful or too loose, when her attention drifts during conversations that should command her focus. Margaret has developed strategies for managing these interactions. She schedules her doses to align with periods when the children are occupied with lessons or play. She delegates more responsibilities to their governess, Miss Patterson, claiming that she wants to ensure the children receive proper educational attention. She has learned to recognize the signs that indicate she should retreat to her room for rest, using headaches and feminine complaints as acceptable excuses. But the children's needs don't always align with Laudanum's schedule. When Charlotte wakes from nightmares or Edmund needs comfort after a playground dispute, Margaret must find ways to provide maternal care while managing her own chemical dependency. These moments reveal the cruelest irony of her situation. The medicine she takes to help her function as a better wife and mother often leaves her less capable of genuine emotional connection with those who need her most. The morning's domestic responsibilities require Margaret to transform into an efficient household manager. She must review menus with cook, approve expenditures with the housekeeper, and coordinate the complex logistics of running a middle-class Victorian home. These tasks demand clear thinking and decisive judgment, but they occur during hours when her laudanum dose is either wearing off or just taking effect. She has learned to time her second dose of the day carefully. Too early, and she risks appearing intoxicated during important household conferences. Too late, and the withdrawal symptoms make concentration impossible. The optimal timing requires her to endure a period of discomfort while appearing completely normal to everyone around her. The housekeeper, Mrs. Caldwell, has managed the Whitmore household for 12 years and prides herself on understanding the rhythms and requirements of proper domestic administration. She has noticed changes in Margaret's management style over the past year. Decisions that were once made quickly now require extended deliberation. Instructions that were previously clear and consistent now sometimes contradict earlier directions. Mrs. Caldwell attributes these changes to the natural stress of managing a growing family and maintaining social obligations. But she has also begun to make subtle adjustments in her own responsibilities. She now confirms important decisions multiple times, keeps more detailed records of household accounts, and has learned to recognize the times of day when Margaret is most capable of clear thinking. The morning's final challenge comes when Margaret must prepare for the day's social obligations. Victorian society operates on an intricate schedule of calling hours, tea parties, charity meetings, and church activities that require precise timing and appropriate behavior. Missing these obligations or appearing inappropriate would damage not only Margaret's reputation, but also Charles's standing in business and social circles. Today, she must attend a committee meeting for the Ladies' Benevolent Society, an organisation dedicated to helping unfortunate women and children in London's poorer districts. The irony of this commitment is not lost on Margaret during her more lucid moments. She dedicates hours to helping women overcome dependency on alcohol and immoral behaviour, while struggling with her own hidden addiction to a substance that is slowly destroying her ability to function as wife, mother, and productive member of society. The committee meeting requires her to appear alert, compassionate, and capable of contributing meaningfully to discussions about fundraising strategies and charitable programs. She must interact with other ladies who pride themselves on moral rectitude and social awareness, many of whom would be shocked to discover that their fellow committee member relies on daily doses of opium to maintain her composure and social functionality. Margaret's preparation for these social obligations has become an elaborate performance. She must judge her laudanum timing to ensure peak effectiveness during crucial moments, select clothing that projects appropriate respectability while accommodating any physical discomfort, and mentally rehearse conversations that will demonstrate her continued engagement with worthy causes and social responsibilities. But even as she prepares to leave the house, Margaret knows that this performance is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The doses that once provided hours of relief now offer shorter periods of functionality. The symptoms she experiences between doses are becoming more severe and noticeable. Most troubling of all, she has begun to recognize that her entire existence now revolves around managing her relationship with laudanum rather than genuinely living her life. As she adjusts her hat and gloves before departing for the committee meeting, Margaret catches sight of herself in the hallway mirror. For just a moment, she sees past the careful makeup and fashionable clothing to the woman underneath. The reflection reveals someone who has become a stranger to herself, trapped in a cycle of dependency that grows stronger each day while the reasons for her original distress fade into increasingly distant memory. The woman staring back at her raises questions that Margaret is not yet ready to confront. How long can she continue this elaborate deception? What will happen when the current supply of laudanum runs out and she needs to acquire more? And most frighteningly, what has she become in her desperate attempt to remain the woman everyone expects her to be? The carriage ride to the Ladies' Benevolent Society meeting becomes a study in careful calculation. Margaret sits rigidly upright, not from proper posture training, but because the slightest relaxation might reveal the tremor that has begun in her left hand. The cobblestone streets jar her bones with each wheel rotation, and she grips her reticule tightly, feeling the reassuring outline of the small emergency bottle hidden within Mrs. Pemberton, her travelling companion for today's meeting. Chatters about the scandalous behaviour of some factory girls who have been seen frequenting public houses. Margaret nods at appropriate intervals. but her attention keeps drifting to the sensation of time passing. Each minute carries her further from her last dose and closer to the moment when maintaining this facade will become impossible. The meeting takes place in the elegant drawing room of Mrs. Victoria Ashford, whose husband's shipping fortune allows her to host such gatherings with appropriate grandeur. 12 ladies arrange themselves on velvet chairs around a mahogany table, laden with fine china and delicate pastries that Margaret knows she cannot eat without risking nausea. As the ladies discuss their current project of establishing a home for fallen women, Margaret finds herself studying their faces with the detached fascination that laudanum sometimes provides. Mrs. Hartwell speaks passionately about the moral dangers facing young women who lack proper guidance, her voice rising with righteous indignation about the corrupting influences of modern city life. Miss Crawford nods vigorously while describing the importance of teaching these unfortunate souls proper domestic skills and Christian values. The cruel irony burns through Margaret's laudanum-dulled consciousness. These women, with their carefully constructed moral superiority, are planning to rescue women from dependencies and poor choices while she sits among them, maintaining perfect posture and appropriate expressions, completely dependent on a substance that grows more necessary with each passing day. When called upon to contribute to the discussion about fundraising strategies, Margaret hears her own voice as if from a great distance. She suggests organising a charity bazaar, complete with handmade goods donated by ladies of good standing. The words flow smoothly, professionally, while her internal awareness focuses on the subtle changes in her body temperature and the slight blurring at the edges of her vision that signals her morning dose. Wearing thin Mrs. Ashford praises Margaret's suggestion with enthusiasm that seems both genuine and slightly patronising. The other ladies murmur approval, and Margaret realises that her reputation as a thoughtful contributor to charitable causes remains intact despite her growing internal chaos. This recognition brings both relief and deeper despair. If she can fool these sharp-eyed arbiters of social respectability, how completely has she learned to deceive herself about the severity of her situation? The meeting concludes with arrangements for next week's activities, and Margaret accepts additional responsibilities with the automatic grace of someone who has perfected the art of appearing capable while feeling anything but. She will coordinate with local merchants for bazaar donations, organise a committee to oversee the preparation of handmade items, and draft correspondence to potential wealthy benefactors. These commitments, which once would have energized her sense of purpose and social contribution, now feel like additional weights in an already overwhelming burden of maintaining normalcy while managing her dependency. Each obligation represents another performance she must deliver, another set of interactions requiring perfect control over her appearance and behavior. The carriage ride home provides temporary respite from social performance, but it also brings Margaret closer to a crisis she has been dreading. Her supply of laudanum is running dangerously low. The bottle hidden in her reticule contains perhaps 3 doses, and the reserves secreted throughout the house will last no more than 2 additional days if she maintains her current consumption. Dr. Thornbury's office represents the obvious solution, but recent visits have become complicated by his increasingly pointed questions about her symptoms and medication needs. Last month, he suggested that her headaches might benefit from reduced laudanum use combined with increased fresh air and moderate exercise. His tone suggested growing suspicion about her actual condition, though his Victorian gentleman's training prevented direct accusations about a lady's moral character. Margaret has considered seeking treatment from other physicians, but London's medical community is surprisingly interconnected, especially among doctors who serve respectable families. Too many visits to different practitioners could generate exactly the kind of gossip that would destroy her reputation and, by extension, Charles's business prospects. The alternative suppliers she has discovered present their own risks and moral complications. Certain chemist shops in less respectable neighbourhoods will sell laudanum without requiring prescriptions, but visiting such establishments would necessitate elaborate deceptions about her destinations and companions. More troubling, these sources often provide laudanum of uncertain quality and potency, creating risks of accidental overdose or inadequate relief. Arriving home, Margaret faces the afternoon's domestic responsibilities with dwindling chemical support and growing anxiety about her supply situation. The household staff expects her direction on preparations for tomorrow evening's dinner party, an obligation that seemed manageable when planned weeks ago, but now looms as an impossible challenge, requiring sustained performance over several hours. Cook needs menu approval and market budget authorization. The housemaids require supervision for the thorough cleaning that precedes entertaining. Mary must receive instructions about which dress to prepare and how to arrange Margaret's hair for maximum elegance and respectability. Each interaction demands clear thinking and decisive leadership at precisely the time when Margaret's ability to provide either is most compromised. She retreats to her private sitting room, ostensibly to review household accounts, but actually to consume what she has decided must be her final dose until she can secure additional supplies. The familiar ritual of measuring and consuming the laudanum provides temporary comfort, but it also forces her to confront the mathematics of her addiction. At her current rate of consumption, she requires approximately 6 doses daily to maintain functionality. Her remaining supply will support perhaps 18 hours of normal behavior, after which withdrawal symptoms will make it impossible to hide her condition from family and staff. The dinner party guests, including Charles's business associates and their wives, will arrive expecting to encounter a charming hostess capable of sophisticated conversation and gracious entertainment. The afternoon passes in a haze of mechanical domestic management, punctuated by moments of sharp anxiety about her deteriorating situation. Margaret approves menus she cannot taste, supervises cleaning she barely sees, and makes decisions about social arrangements, while her primary focus remains fixed on the laudanum bottle and its diminishing contents. Charles returns from his banking offices in excellent spirits, having concluded a profitable arrangement involving railway investments in India. His enthusiasm about expanding business opportunities requires Margaret to appear interested and supportive, while privately calculating how many hours remain before her carefully constructed normalcy begins to collapse. Their conversation during afternoon tea reveals the gulf that has opened between Margaret's public performance and private reality. Charles describes his day with the confidence of someone whose challenges involve external problems, requiring logical solutions and collaborative effort. Margaret listens with the desperate attention of someone whose primary challenge involves concealing internal chaos that grows more unmanageable with each passing hour. When Charles mentions that tomorrow's dinner guests will include Mr. Pemberton from the Colonial Office and his notoriously observant wife, Margaret's smile never wavers. Even as her internal panic intensifies, Mrs. Pemberton possesses the social radar of someone who has spent decades navigating diplomatic circles where personal weaknesses can become political liabilities. Her ability to detect and discreetly catalogue others' vulnerabilities is legendary among London's social circles. The evening brings Margaret's children back from their afternoon activities, full of stories about their lessons and playground adventures that require maternal attention and appropriate responses. Edmund describes his progress with Latin conjugations, while Charlotte recounts a dispute with her best friend that needs wise maternal guidance for resolution. These interactions, which once provided Margaret with genuine joy and purpose, now require enormous effort to navigate successfully. The laudanum affects her ability to process complex emotional information, making it difficult to provide the nuanced responses that effective parenting demands. She finds herself offering generic encouragement and simplified advice when her children need more sophisticated emotional support. Charlotte's tear-filled account of feeling excluded by her former friend requires exactly the kind of empathetic engagement that laudanum makes nearly impossible. Margaret hears the words and recognizes the emotional pain, but her ability to respond with appropriate maternal wisdom feels filtered through layers of chemical distortion that prevent authentic connection. As evening approaches and the household settles into its dinner routines, Margaret faces a series of calculations that will determine whether she can maintain her deception through another day. Her remaining laudanum must be rationed to provide minimal functionality during tomorrow's dinner party. But this strategy guarantees that she will experience withdrawal symptoms at precisely the moment when social performance is most crucial. The alternative involves consuming her remaining supply this evening to ensure comfortable sleep and morning functionality. But this approach leaves her completely without chemical support during tomorrow's social obligations. Either choice represents a form of Russian roulette with her reputation, her marriage, and her family's social standing. Sitting at her dressing table as Mary helps prepare her for the evening meal, Margaret studies her reflection with the clinical detachment that laudanum sometimes provides. The woman in the mirror has become expert at concealing the physical signs of her dependency. But she cannot hide from herself the knowledge that this elaborate performance is approaching its inevitable conclusion. The face staring back at her belongs to someone who has traded authentic living for chemical management of existence. Every relationship, every responsibility, and every moment of apparent normalcy now depends on maintaining access to a substance that has transformed from medicine into master. The Victorian woman who once took laudanum to help her fulfill her duties as wife and mother has become someone who fulfills those duties primarily to maintain access to laudanum. Tonight's dinner conversation with Charles and the children will require her to appear interested in their concerns while privately obsessing about tomorrow's supply crisis. She will discuss household matters, respond to questions about social obligations, and participate in family routines, while knowing that her ability to continue these performances hangs by the thread of a few remaining doses in a brown glass bottle. The evening meal passes in a blur of mechanical responses and careful portion management. Margaret pushes food around her plate while contributing appropriately to conversations about Charles's business prospects and the children's educational progress. Every word requires conscious effort to pronounce clearly. Every gesture demands deliberate control to appear natural. After dinner, as the family gathers in the drawing room for their customary evening activities, Margaret excuses herself to check on household preparations for tomorrow's entertaining. In reality, she retreats to her sitting room to stare at the laudanum bottle and confront the impossible mathematics of addiction. 3 doses remain. Tomorrow's dinner party will last approximately 4 hours and require peak performance throughout. Her morning responsibilities demand functionality from the moment she wakes. The afternoon's preparations will test her organizational abilities and social judgment. Evening's entertainment will challenge every aspect of her carefully constructed persona. Margaret holds the bottle up to the lamplight, watching the dark liquid catch and reflect the flame. This small container holds the difference between maintaining her life's elaborate deception and facing the consequences of exposure. But it also represents something more troubling than immediate crisis management. The woman who once used laudanum to enhance her capabilities has become someone whose capabilities exist only through laudanum use. The medicine that promised to make her a better wife, mother, and social contributor has transformed her into an actress playing those roles, while her authentic self disappears behind chemical management and performance anxiety. As London's evening fog begins to curl around the windows and gas lamps flicker to life along the street, Margaret prepares for what may be her final night of maintaining the illusion that she remains in control of her circumstances rather than completely controlled by them. Tomorrow will bring the ultimate test of whether her years of practice at concealing dependency have prepared her for the challenge of entertaining society's most observant members while experiencing the early stages of withdrawal from the substance that has become more essential to her daily functioning than food, sleep, or honest human connection. The grandfather clock chimes 10 times, and Margaret realizes that in 12 hours, she must begin the performance of her lifetime while knowing that the chemical support system enabling that performance is about to disappear entirely. The morning arrives with the relentless punctuality that Victorian society demands. But Margaret's body rebels against consciousness. With every fibre, her skin feels like it's been turned inside out, hypersensitive to the rough linen sheets that once provided comfort. The grandfather clock's chiming seems to pierce directly through her skull, each note reverberating with painful clarity that makes her want to burrow deeper into the mattress. But hiding is not an option today. Margaret's hands shake violently as she reaches for the laudanum bottle, and for a terrifying moment, her trembling fingers nearly send it crashing to the floor. The sound of liquid sloshing against glass has never seemed so precious or so threatening. She measures out half her usual morning dose, knowing that preserving her supply means accepting a day of barely manageable discomfort. The reduced amount burns going down, but provides only a shadow of its usual relief. Her bones still ache, her hands still tremble, and the crushing weight of reality presses down with suffocating intensity. This is what functional addiction looks like when the function begins to fail. Mary appears at the usual time, but her sharp eyes immediately detect something amiss. Margaret's complexion has taken on a greyish pallor that rouge cannot completely disguise, and her movements possess the careful deliberation of someone fighting to maintain control over rebellious limbs. "Shall I select the blue silk for this evening, ma'am?" Mary asks, while helping Margaret into her corset. But her tone carries subtle concern that wasn't present yesterday. Margaret nods, because speaking requires more energy than she can spare for casual conversation. The corset's tight lacing actually provides relief this morning, its rigid structure compensating for the internal chaos that threatens to manifest in visible tremors and unsteady posture. Breakfast becomes an exercise in theatrical performance that would impress the finest actresses on London's stages. Margaret must appear across from Charles, while internally battling waves of nausea, cold sweats, and the peculiar sensation that her skin doesn't quite fit properly over her bones. Every bite of toast requires conscious effort to chew and swallow, while maintaining conversation about the day's schedule demands mental resources she can barely access. Charles discusses his expectation that tonight's dinner guests will be impressed by Margaret's reputation for elegant entertaining and sophisticated conversation. His confidence in her abilities feels like a crushing weight, because he has no idea that his wife's renowned social graces now depend entirely on chemical support that is rapidly disappearing. Edmund and Charlotte chatter about their lessons and plans, their voices seeming to come from a great distance. Despite sitting directly across the table, Margaret responds with maternal encouragement, but her words feel disconnected from any genuine emotional engagement. The laudanum deficiency has created a barrier between her consciousness and authentic feeling that makes real connection with her children nearly impossible. When Charlotte asks for help resolving yesterday's friendship conflict, Margaret's advice emerges as generic platitudes about kindness and forgiveness, rather than the nuanced guidance her daughter needs. The child's disappointed expression reveals that even an 8-year-old can detect the absence of genuine maternal presence behind the appropriate words. The morning's household management sessions become increasingly challenging, as Margaret's reduced dose fails to provide adequate cognitive clarity for complex decision-making. Mrs. Caldwell presents the day's schedule of preparations for evening entertainment, but the details blur together in Margaret's compromised consciousness. Menu planning requires her to make choices about foods she cannot imagine eating while battling constant nausea. Wine selection demands sophisticated understanding of what will complement various courses when her current chemical state makes all alcohol seem potentially dangerous. Table arrangement discussions require spatial reasoning abilities that feel frustratingly elusive. Mrs. Caldwell begins repeating important information without being asked, apparently recognizing that Margaret's attention span has become unreliable. The housekeeper's tactful accommodation provides essential support, while also highlighting how obviously Margaret's capabilities have deteriorated. By mid-morning, Margaret realizes that maintaining her usual schedule of social and domestic activities will be impossible without additional laudanum. The committee meeting she promised to attend requires 2 hours of sustained social performance that her current chemical state cannot support. the afternoon preparations for dinner, entertaining demand energy and focus that remain completely beyond her reach. She sends regrets to Mrs. Ashford about missing today's Ladies' Benevolent Society meeting, claiming a sudden onset of influenza that might prove contagious to other ladies. The lie flows smoothly because it contains enough truth to feel believable. Margaret does feel ill, desperately so, though her condition results from chemical withdrawal rather than infectious disease. The afternoon hours stretch endlessly as Margaret attempts to rest, while knowing that sleep will not provide the relief her body craves. She lies in her darkened bedroom, listening to household sounds that seem amplified beyond normal volume. Every footstep in the corridor sounds like thunder. Every door closing reverberates like cannon fire, and the ordinary sounds of domestic activity assault her hypersensitive nervous system. Her thoughts race in chaotic circles around the evening's approaching deadline. In 4 hours, guests will arrive expecting to encounter the charming hostess whose reputation for elegant entertaining has made invitations to Whitmore dinner parties highly coveted among London's respectable society. They will expect sophisticated conversation, gracious hospitality, and the kind of effortless social management that makes successful dinner parties appear simple while actually requiring enormous skill and energy. Margaret knows she possesses those skills, but only when supported by adequate laudanum. Without chemical assistance, she faces the prospect of attempting complex social performance while experiencing symptoms that make basic conversation difficult and sustained attention nearly impossible. The cruel mathematics of addiction force her to make increasingly desperate calculations. She can consume her remaining laudanum now and hope its effects last through the evening's entertainment. But this strategy leaves her completely without support for tomorrow's recovery and the following days of social obligations. Alternatively, she can save her final doses for the dinner party itself, but this approach guarantees that she will begin the evening already compromised by withdrawal symptoms. Neither option offers any realistic prospect of maintaining her deception beyond tonight. The evening's guests will either witness her struggling with the early stages of laudanum withdrawal, or observe her managing the later stages tomorrow when she has no chemical resources remaining. As afternoon light begins to fade and the household staff intensifies preparations for evening entertainment, Margaret forces herself to confront a possibility she has been avoiding throughout months of increasing dependency. Her elaborate system of chemical management and social performance has reached its natural conclusion. Tonight's dinner party may represent the final act of a deception that has consumed 3 years of her life and transformed her from a capable woman into someone whose existence revolves entirely around managing access to opium. The irony strikes her with painful clarity as she listens to servants preparing the drawing room for guests who will discuss the moral failings of London's unfortunate women while being entertained by someone whose own moral compromise has become the central organizing principle of her existence. She has become exactly the kind of woman her charitable work claims to rescue. But her middle-class respectability and medical prescription provide camouflage that makes her addiction invisible to the same social observers who pride themselves on detecting moral weakness in others. Charles arrives home from his banking offices with excitement about the evening's business potential, completely unaware that his wife's ability to serve as an effective hostess hangs by the thread of 2 remaining doses in a brown glass bottle. His confidence in her social abilities feels like a lead weight pressing down on Margaret's chest, because she understands better than anyone how completely his trust has been misplaced. The pre-dinner hour approaches with inexorable certainty, and Margaret must decide whether to consume her penultimate dose now or save it for the moment when social performance becomes absolutely critical. Either choice represents a form of gambling with stakes that include her marriage, her children's futures, and her family's position in society. She chooses to wait, enduring another hour of increasing physical and psychological distress, while praying that her final chemical resources will provide enough support to carry her through the evening's performance. As she allows Mary to help her into the elaborate evening dress that projects elegant respectability, Margaret catches sight of herself in the mirror and sees a woman who has become a stranger to herself. The reflection reveals someone who has spent 3 years learning to prioritize chemical management over authentic living, performance over genuine connection, and social deception over honest relationships. The Victorian lady staring back at her has perfected the art of appearing normal while being anything but, of seeming capable while being completely dependent, of looking healthy while slowly destroying herself through daily doses of medicine that has become poison. The dinner bell chimes downstairs, signaling that guests are beginning to arrive for an evening that will test whether years of practice at concealing addiction have prepared Margaret for the ultimate challenge of entertaining society's most observant members while experiencing withdrawal from the substance that has become more essential to her daily functioning than air or water. Tonight will determine whether she can maintain her deception long enough to find a solution to her supply crisis, or whether 3 years of chemical dependency will finally expose itself to the very people whose approval has made all the elaborate performance seem necessary in the first place. The first guests arrive precisely at 7:30, their carriages clattering to a stop outside the Whitmore residence as Margaret descends the main staircase with practiced grace. Her final dose courses through her bloodstream, providing just enough chemical courage to face what lies ahead. But she can feel it already beginning to fade, like morning mist burning off under an unforgiving sun. Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton enter first, followed by the Ashfords and Dr. Hartwell with his sharp-eyed wife. These are people who have built their reputations on reading social situations with surgical precision, detecting the slightest crack in propriety's facade. Tonight, they will be studying Margaret's performance without realizing they're watching someone whose entire existence has become a carefully choreographed dance around chemical dependency. The drawing room fills with the familiar sounds of Victorian social gathering. Silk rustles against silk as ladies settle into chairs arranged for optimal conversation flow. Crystal glasses chime softly as Charles serves sherry to the gentlemen while discussing railway investments and colonial opportunities. The gas lamps cast warm light over faces that expect nothing more challenging than an evening of refined entertainment and stimulating discourse. Margaret moves through these opening moments with the fluid precision of someone who has rehearsed every gesture. She compliments Mrs. Pemberton's emerald brooch with exactly the right degree of admiration. She inquires about Dr. Hartwell's recent paper on nervous disorders with sophisticated interest that masks her desperate personal relevance to his research. She guides conversation with the subtle skill that has made her reputation as a hostess worth cultivating. But beneath this polished surface, Margaret's body begins its rebellion against chemical withdrawal. Her hands develop a barely perceptible tremor that she disguises by keeping them occupied with fan adjustments and jewelry touches. Her vision occasionally blurs at the edges, forcing her to blink rapidly while pretending to consider thoughtful responses to guests' observations. The transition to dinner requires navigating the formal procession to the dining room while maintaining perfect posture. Despite muscles that feel increasingly unreliable, Margaret takes Charles's arm with practiced grace, but she grips more tightly than usual, using his stability to compensate for her own growing unsteadiness. The dining room has been transformed into a showcase of middle-class prosperity and refined taste. Crystal goblets catch lamplight like scattered diamonds. Silver service gleams against white linen. The elaborate centerpiece of hothouse flowers creates an atmosphere of abundance that speaks to Charles's business success and Margaret's domestic capabilities. Seating arrangements place Margaret at the foot of the table, where she can observe all guests while directing the service's complex choreography. This position requires sustained attention and quick decision-making as each course progresses according to precise timing that cannot accommodate hostess incapacity or distraction. The soup course begins smoothly, with Margaret managing the subtle signals that coordinate servants' movements while participating in conversation about recent developments in Egyptian archaeology. But as the laudanum's effects continue diminishing, Maintaining this dual focus becomes increasingly challenging. Mrs. Pemberton launches into detailed observations about the declining moral standards among London's working classes, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her opinions received as social gospel. Margaret nods at appropriate intervals, but finds herself struggling to process the complex arguments while simultaneously monitoring whether the wine service is proceeding correctly. When Mr. Ashford asks for her opinion about establishing industrial schools for wayward youth, Margaret's response emerges as carefully neutral generalities rather than the thoughtful analysis that her reputation would suggest. She speaks about the importance of education and moral guidance, while privately focusing all her energy on preventing her voice from revealing the slight slur that laudanum withdrawal has begun to create. The fish course arrives with its accompanying ritual of wine changes and utensil adjustments, but Margaret's ability to coordinate these complex social mechanics feels increasingly compromised. She signals for the wrong wine to be served with the turbot, then must discreetly correct the error while pretending the confusion resulted from distraction rather than cognitive impairment. Dr. Hartwell begins discussing his recent observations about the increasing prevalence of nervous disorders among respectable women, describing symptoms that Margaret recognizes with terrifying accuracy. He speaks about tremors, digestive disruptions, sleep disturbances, and emotional instability, as if reading directly from her private medical journal. The most troubling cases, he continues, cutting his fish with precise movements, involve ladies who have become dependent on medical treatments that were initially prescribed for legitimate complaints. They develop tolerance requiring increased doses, then experience withdrawal symptoms that mimic the original conditions. Margaret's fork slips slightly in her grasp, creating a small scraping sound against china that seems amplified in her hypersensitive awareness. She recovers quickly, but notices Mrs. Hartwell's sharp glance in her direction. The woman's expression suggests professional interest rather than social concern, as if she's observing a fascinating specimen rather than a dinner companion. Surely such dependencies are rare among ladies of good breeding. Mrs. Pemberton interjects with the confidence of someone whose moral superiority has never been tested by genuine suffering. Unfortunately not, Dr. Hartwell replies gravely. The very qualities we admire in refined women, their sensitivity, their dedication to family welfare, their willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for others' benefit, make them particularly vulnerable to these medical dependencies. The conversation continues around Margaret as she struggles to maintain her composure while listening to clinical descriptions of her own condition presented as academic curiosity. Every symptom the doctor describes matches her current experience with devastating accuracy. The tremors she's fighting to conceal, the digestive distress making each bite of food a challenge, the cognitive fog that makes following complex conversations increasingly difficult. When Charles asks about treatment options for such unfortunate cases, Margaret forces herself to appear interested in Dr. Hartwell's response while privately calculating how many minutes remain before her symptoms become impossible to disguise. Treatment requires complete cessation of the problematic medication, Dr. Hartwell explains with clinical detachment. The withdrawal process is intensely uncomfortable, often lasting several weeks. Patients experience severe physical and emotional distress that frequently drives them back to the very substances causing their difficulties. Margaret's water glass trembles slightly in her hand as she lifts it to her lips, the liquid providing temporary relief for her increasingly dry mouth. But the simple action of drinking requires conscious coordination that once would have been automatic. She sets the glass down with exaggerated care, aware that her motor control is becoming unreliable. The meat course arrives with its elaborate presentation of roasted beef, accompanied by seasonal vegetables and rich sauces that normally would have showcased cooks' exceptional skills. But Margaret's compromised digestive system rebels against the rich foods, creating waves of nausea that she must hide behind delicate nibbling and strategic conversation redirection. Mr. Pemberton begins describing recent developments in India's railway construction, his enthusiasm for colonial progress requiring engaged responses from his dinner companions. Margaret contributes appropriate observations about the benefits of improved transportation for British commerce, but her words feel disconnected from any genuine understanding or interest. The room's temperature seems to fluctuate wildly, leaving Margaret alternately flushed and chilled, despite the consistent warmth maintained by the household staff. She uses her fan strategically to disguise these temperature variations while participating in discussions about literature, politics, and social reform that once would have energized her intellectual engagement. Mrs. Ashford asks about Margaret's recent charitable activities with the Ladies' Benevolent Society, requiring detailed responses about fundraising strategies and assistance programs for unfortunate women. The irony burns through Margaret's chemical haze as she describes efforts to help women overcome dependencies while battling her own addiction to the substance that makes such conversations possible. We focus particularly on women who have fallen into reliance on gin or other spirits, Margaret explains, her voice maintaining its cultured tone despite increasing effort required for speech clarity. Such dependencies destroy their ability to maintain proper households or care adequately for their children. The words taste like ashes in her mouth because she understands better than anyone how dependency transforms capable women into actors, playing roles they can no longer authentically fulfill. Her own children receive increasingly hollow maternal attention, while she focuses primarily on managing access to the medicine that has become more important than genuine family connection. As the dinner progresses through its elaborate courses, Margaret's ability to maintain her performance degrades incrementally but relentlessly. Each conversation requires more conscious effort. Every social gesture demands deliberate control. The gracious hostess persona that once flowed naturally now feels like an elaborate costume that no longer fits properly. During a lull in conversation, while servants clear plates and prepare for the next course, Mrs. Hartwell leans forward with the expression of someone who has made an interesting observation. "My dear Margaret, you seem rather pale this evening. I do hope you're not developing the influenza that's been circulating through Belgravia. Perhaps you should consider retiring early if you're feeling unwell." The suggestion sounds helpful, but Margaret detects underlying scrutiny in Mrs. Hartwell's tone. The woman's medical training through her husband's practice has taught her to recognize symptoms that social politeness typically ignores. Her concern may be genuine, but it also represents potential exposure of Margaret's carefully guarded secret. "I'm quite well, thank you," Margaret replies with a smile that requires enormous effort to maintain, perhaps a touch of fatigue from today's household preparations, but nothing that won't resolve with proper rest. The response satisfies social requirements while deflecting medical attention, but Margaret recognizes that her window for maintaining this deception is rapidly closing. The laudanum's protective effects have almost completely disappeared, leaving her to manage complex social obligations through willpower and performance skills that are proving inadequate for the challenge. The cheese course brings new challenges as Margaret must appear interested in Mr. Ashford's detailed account of his recent business trip to Manchester, while privately focusing all her attention on preventing her hands from shaking visibly. She clasps them in her lap between necessary gestures, using the tablecloth to conceal tremors that grow more pronounced with each passing minute. When Dr. Hartwell asks about her opinion regarding new treatments for nervous conditions among ladies, Margaret's response emerges as carefully non-committal observations, rather than the informed discussion her reputation would suggest. She speaks about the importance of proper medical supervision, while knowing that her own medical situation has evolved far beyond any doctor's ability to provide simple solutions. The evening's final course arrives as Margaret's chemical reserves reach complete depletion. Dessert service requires her to coordinate the presentation of elaborate sweets, while participating in conversations about upcoming social events that assume her continued participation in London's respectable society. But Margaret understands that tonight represents the end of her ability to maintain the elaborate deception that has defined 3 years of her existence. Tomorrow will bring withdrawal symptoms too severe to disguise, supply problems too complex to solve through normal channels, and social obligations too demanding to fulfill without chemical support that no longer exists. As guests prepare to transition back to the drawing room for after-dinner conversation and entertainment, Margaret faces the final test of whether her years of practice at concealing addiction have prepared her for managing social obligations while experiencing the full onset of laudanum withdrawal. The woman who entered this evening confident in her ability to maintain her deception for one more night now realizes that her chemical dependency has reached its inevitable conclusion. The elaborate performance that once seemed sustainable has become impossible to continue, forcing her to confront consequences she has spent months trying to avoid. The drawing room beckons with its familiar comforts, but Margaret views the prospect of extended conversation with mounting dread. Her guests expect another hour of sophisticated discourse about art, literature, and society's pressing concerns. They anticipate the witty observations and thoughtful questions that have made her drawing room a coveted destination among London's cultural elite. Charles leads the gentlemen in animated discussion about parliamentary debates, while the ladies settle into comfortable chairs arranged around the fireplace. Mrs. Pemberton produces her embroidery work, the delicate stitching providing occupation for her hands, while her sharp mind dissects the evening's conversational offerings. Margaret positions herself near the piano, ostensibly to provide musical entertainment if requested, but actually to have something solid to lean against as waves of physical discomfort wash over her increasingly rebellious body. The instrument's polished surface reflects the gaslight, creating patterns that seem to shift and dance in ways that have nothing to do with the actual flame movement. Mrs. Ashford launches into enthusiastic descriptions of recent exhibitions at the Royal Academy, her cultured voice carrying across the room with confidence born of genuine artistic knowledge. She expects Margaret to contribute informed opinions about contemporary painters and sculptural innovations, discussions that once energized Margaret's intellectual engagement. Instead, Margaret finds herself nodding mechanically while struggling to process the complex aesthetic arguments being presented. The words seem to arrive in her consciousness slightly delayed, requiring conscious effort to connect meaning with sound. Her responses emerge as polite agreements rather than the insightful commentary her reputation would suggest. The new pre-Raphaelite works display such revolutionary approaches to color and composition. Mrs. Ashford continues with growing enthusiasm. Don't you find their rejection of classical constraints absolutely liberating, my dear Margaret? The question hangs in the air while Margaret marshals her failing cognitive resources to formulate an appropriate response. Art criticism requires sophisticated analysis that her compromised mental state cannot adequately provide. She speaks about the importance of artistic innovation, while internally focusing all her energy on preventing her voice from revealing the increasing slur that accompanies laudanum withdrawal. Dr. Hartwell observes these interactions with the clinical attention of someone trained to detect subtle signs of distress beneath social politeness. His earlier discussion of medical dependencies among respectable women seems to have sharpened his awareness of symptoms that might otherwise pass unnoticed in drawing room conversation. When Margaret excuses herself to check on the servants' preparations for tea service, her movements carry the careful deliberation of someone fighting to maintain physical control. Each step requires conscious coordination as the familiar room seems to shift slightly around her, distances becoming unreliable and furniture edges appearing less distinct than they should. The brief respite in the hallway provides temporary relief from performance demands, but it also forces Margaret to confront the mathematical certainty of her situation. No laudanum remains in her possession. Tomorrow's obligations will require social and domestic capabilities that withdrawal symptoms will make impossible to provide. Her reflection in the hallway mirror reveals the physical toll that chemical dependency has extracted over months of increasing use. The elegant woman staring back possesses all the external markers of respectability and refinement, but her eyes carry a desperate quality that no amount of careful grooming can completely disguise. Returning to the drawing room requires summoning reserves of social energy that feel increasingly depleted. Margaret must appear interested in Mrs. Hartwell's detailed account of recent charitable activities, while privately calculating how many more minutes she can maintain this elaborate performance. The conversation turns to upcoming social events that assume Margaret's continued participation in London's cultural calendar. Garden parties, charity bazaars, and literary salons that once provided genuine pleasure now loom as impossible challenges, requiring capabilities she no longer possesses without chemical support. Charles approaches with evident pride in his wife's social accomplishments, completely unaware that her renowned abilities as hostess and conversationalist depend entirely on substances he would find morally reprehensible if he understood their role in her daily functioning. Margaret has such remarkable insights about contemporary social issues, he tells Dr. Hartwell with genuine admiration. Her work with unfortunate women has given her unique perspectives on the challenges facing our changing society. The praise feels like physical weight pressing down on Margaret's shoulders because she recognizes how completely her husband's confidence has been misplaced. The woman he describes exists only through chemical enhancement, while her authentic self has become increasingly inaccessible beneath layers of dependency and deception. Mrs. Pemberton requests musical entertainment, expecting Margaret to demonstrate the accomplished piano skills that have enhanced many previous social gatherings. The instrument represents another test of capabilities that laudanum withdrawal has compromised, requiring finger coordination and mental focus that feel frustratingly elusive. Margaret approaches the piano with determination, masking internal chaos, her hands trembling slightly as they find familiar keys. The opening notes of a Mozart sonata emerge cleanly, muscle memory temporarily overcoming chemical deficiency to produce sounds that meet social expectations. But as the piece progresses, subtle errors begin appearing in passages that once flowed effortlessly from her fingers. Wrong notes creep into familiar harmonies, while rhythm becomes unreliable despite her desperate concentration on maintaining proper tempo and phrasing. The guests politely applaud her abbreviated performance, while Margaret recognizes that even her musical abilities have become casualties of her increasing dependency. Skills that once provided genuine satisfaction now require chemical support to achieve competent execution. As the evening draws toward its socially acceptable conclusion, Margaret faces the prospect of bidding farewell to guests who expect to encounter the same charming hostess at future gatherings. Their invitations and social obligations assume capabilities she understands may no longer exist beyond tonight's chemical exhaustion. The ritual of departure requires final demonstrations of gracious hospitality, while Margaret's physical symptoms intensify with each passing minute. Handshakes must appear steady despite increasing tremors. Farewells must sound genuine, despite the emotional disconnection that withdrawal creates between intention and expression. Mrs. Hartwell's parting comment carries particular weight as she takes Margaret's hand in farewell. "Do take care of your health, my dear." These nervous conditions can develop so quickly among ladies who push themselves too hard in service to others. The words sound like kindly concern, but Margaret detects underlying scrutiny that suggests professional interest rather than simple social politeness. Dr. Hartwell's wife possesses enough medical knowledge to recognize symptoms that social convention typically ignores. Charles escorts their final guests to waiting carriages, while Margaret retreats to her sitting room, ostensibly to review the evening's success, but actually to confront the complete absence of chemical resources that have sustained her performance for 3 years. The empty laudanum bottle sits on her dressing table like an accusation, its brown glass reflecting lamplight while offering no solutions to the crisis that tomorrow will bring. Withdrawal symptoms that have been manageable during tonight's social obligations will intensify overnight, creating physical and psychological distress that cannot be hidden from household staff or family members. Margaret's elaborate system of deception has reached its natural conclusion, The medicine that once enhanced her capabilities has become the only thing preventing complete collapse of her ability to function as wife, mother, and respectable member of society. As London's fog thickens outside her windows and the grandfather clock chimes midnight, Margaret understands that she has approximately 6 hours before withdrawal symptoms make maintaining any pretense of normalcy impossible. The dawn will bring not just a new day, but the inevitable exposure of 3 years of hidden addiction that has consumed every authentic aspect of her existence. The Victorian woman who began using laudanum to become a better version of herself must now face the consequences of becoming someone whose entire identity depends on chemical support that no longer exists. Tomorrow will reveal whether the elaborate performance she has maintained can survive the complete absence of the substance that made that performance possible. The house settles into nighttime quiet around her, while Margaret confronts the mathematics of addiction that admit no negotiation and offer no reprieve. Her carefully constructed world stands poised to collapse under the weight of a dependency that began as medicine and evolved into the organizing principle of her entire existence. 3 years of increasing doses have created physical and psychological needs that will not be denied by social obligations or family responsibilities. The woman who once took laudanum to help her fulfill her duties as Victorian lady must now face the possibility that those duties may be impossible to perform without the chemical support she can no longer obtain. The final reckoning approaches with the certainty of sunrise, and Margaret realizes that her long battle to maintain respectability while managing secret addiction has reached its inevitable conclusion. Everything she has worked to preserve now hangs in the balance of forces beyond her control, and the dawn will determine whether 3 years of elaborate deception can survive the harsh light of chemical withdrawal and social scrutiny. The night stretches ahead with promises of sleeplessness and increasing discomfort that will test every strategy she has developed for concealing her true condition. But worse than physical symptoms is the growing recognition that she has become a stranger to herself, someone whose authentic desires and capabilities have been obscured by years of chemical management and social performance. Margaret sits in her darkened room, holding the empty laudanum bottle and wondering who she might have been if she had never taken that first prescribed dose 3 years ago. The question haunts her because she can no longer remember what it felt like to exist without chemical mediation of reality, to make decisions based on genuine preferences rather than laudanum availability, or to interact with loved ones through authentic emotion rather than pharmaceutical assistance. The woman reflected in her mirror has mastered the art of appearing normal while being anything but, of seeming capable while being completely dependent, of looking healthy while slowly destroying herself through daily doses of medicine that became poison so gradually she never noticed the transformation until it was complete. Now, facing the prospect of existence without laudanum for the first time in 3 years, Margaret must discover whether any authentic self remains beneath the elaborate construction of chemical dependency and social deception that has defined her recent existence. The answer will emerge over the coming days as withdrawal forces her to confront not just physical symptoms, but the fundamental question of who she actually is when stripped of the substance that has become more essential to her daily functioning than food, water, or honest human connection. The grandfather clock chimes 1 in the morning, and Margaret understands that she has perhaps 5 hours before the household awakens, expecting to encounter the capable woman whose reputation has been built on abilities that may exist only through chemical enhancement. The reckoning she has avoided through months of careful supply management and elaborate performance can no longer be postponed. Tomorrow will test whether the woman who entered laudanum dependency as treatment for postpartum difficulties possesses the strength to survive its complete absence while maintaining the social obligations and family responsibilities that make retreat from public life impossible. The stakes could not be higher, because failure means not just personal collapse, but the destruction of everything and everyone she has spent 3 years trying to protect through her elaborate deceptions. The night deepens around her while Margaret prepares for the most difficult performance of her life. knowing that this time she must somehow succeed without the chemical support that has made all previous performances possible. The teenage bride who once believed laudanum would help her become a better wife and mother must now discover whether she possesses the courage to face life as herself. Whatever that might mean, after 3 years of chemical mediation have obscured her authentic identity beneath layers of dependency and desperate social performance. The dawn arrives with cruel inevitability, filtering through heavy curtains that can no longer shield Margaret from the harsh reality awaiting beyond her bedroom door. Her body has become a battlefield where every nerve ending screams in rebellion against the absence of its accustomed chemical comfort. Sleep never came, despite hours of lying motionless, listening to her heart pound against her ribs with the frantic rhythm of approaching catastrophe. The familiar morning sounds of the household stirring to life echo through the walls like distant thunder. Cook's footsteps in the kitchen below, the housemaid's whispered conversations in the corridors, Charles's boots on the wooden floor as he prepares for another day at the bank. Each sound pierces through Margaret's hypersensitive awareness with painful clarity, reminding her that the world expects her participation despite her complete inability to provide it. Mary's gentle knock on the door arrives at precisely 7:30, the same time it has arrived every morning for the past 5 years. But today, that simple sound feels like a death knell announcing the beginning of Margaret's exposure. She cannot hide in her room indefinitely without raising questions that will lead to discoveries she desperately wants to avoid. "Come in," Margaret manages, her voice emerging as a hoarse whisper that bears no resemblance to the cultured tones her lady's maid expects to hear. Mary enters with her usual efficient cheerfulness, carrying fresh water for washing and the carefully pressed morning dress that will transform Margaret into the appearance of respectability. But her practiced smile falters when she sees her mistress's condition in the unforgiving morning light. Margaret's nightgown clings to skin damp with cold perspiration. Her hair lies plastered against her skull in dark tangles that no amount of brushing will easily remedy. Most tellingly, her hands shake with violent tremors that make gripping the water glass an impossible challenge. "Ma'am, you look dreadfully ill," Mary says with genuine concern that cuts through her professional discretion. "Perhaps I should send for Dr. Thornbury immediately." The suggestion strikes terror into Margaret's already racing heart. Dr. Thornbury's examination would reveal symptoms that could not be explained by any respectable illness. His questions about her medication use would expose the dependency she has fought so desperately to conceal. Worst of all, his medical authority could result in treatments that would make her current suffering seem mild by comparison. "No doctors," Margaret says, with more firmness than her physical condition should allow. "Just help me dress. I'll feel better once I'm properly attired." Mary's expression reveals her skepticism. But years of service have taught her when to press concerns and when to follow instructions without argument. She begins the elaborate process of transforming Margaret from invalid into lady. Though both women understand they are attempting something that may prove impossible, the corset provides blessed relief by holding Margaret's trembling body in rigid structure that compensates for muscles that no longer obey her conscious control. The layers of petticoats and bustle create a framework that allows her to stand upright despite legs that feel like water beneath her. Most importantly, the complete coverage of Victorian dress conceals the physical symptoms that would immediately betray her condition to anyone who might observe her closely. But no amount of careful dressing can disguise the changes in Margaret's face. Her complexion has taken on the greyish pallor of someone fighting internal battles that are being steadily lost. Dark circles beneath her eyes speak of sleepless nights and unimaginable distress. Most troubling of all, her pupils dilate and contract erratically as her nervous system struggles to function without its accustomed chemical support. Mary applies rouge with unusual thickness, attempting to restore some semblance of healthy colour to cheeks that appear almost translucent in the morning light. Powder helps minimize the sheen of perspiration that breaks out across Margaret's forehead, despite the cool temperature. But cosmetics can only accomplish so much when the underlying condition continues deteriorating with each passing hour. The breakfast ordeal looms ahead like an insurmountable mountain. Margaret must appear at the table at 8 o'clock sharp, looking fresh and capable of managing another day's domestic responsibilities. She must make conversation with Charles about his banking concerns while participating in the children's morning routines. Most challenging of all, she must accomplish these social requirements while battling physical symptoms that make basic concentration nearly impossible. The staircase becomes an exercise in controlled terror as Margaret grips the banister with desperate intensity, each step downward requiring conscious coordination of movements that once flowed automatically. The grandfather clock's ticking seems amplified beyond normal volume, each second marking another moment closer to inevitable exposure. Charles sits at his usual place, absorbed in financial newspapers that detail railway investments and colonial developments. His morning routine proceeds with comfortable predictability that assumes his wife's continued participation in their established domestic patterns. He expects her to pour his coffee, discuss the day's social obligations, and provide the kind of pleasant morning conversation that has characterized their marriage for 8 years. Edmund and Charlotte chatter about their lessons and playground adventures with the unconscious cruelty of children who assume adult stability will always be available to support their emotional needs. They require maternal attention, guidance for daily challenges, and the kind of nurturing presence that has defined Margaret's identity as devoted mother. But the woman attempting to fulfill these expectations feels like an imposter wearing Margaret's clothes while lacking any of her capabilities. Every gesture requires enormous conscious effort. Each word must be carefully considered before speaking to prevent the slurring that accompanies her current condition. Most exhausting of all, she must maintain the appearance of interested engagement while internally focusing all her energy on preventing complete physical collapse. "You seem rather quiet this morning, my dear," Charles observes without looking up from his newspaper. "I trust you're not developing the influenza that Mrs. Pemberton mentioned at dinner last evening." The casual comment feels like a trap designed to test Margaret's ability to maintain her deception. Charles possesses no medical training, but 8 years of marriage have given him intimate knowledge of his wife's normal patterns and behaviors. Any significant deviation from established routines will attract the kind of attention that could lead to discoveries Margaret cannot survive. "Perhaps a touch of fatigue from yesterday's entertaining," she replies, proud that her voice emerges without obvious tremor, despite the tremendous effort required for speech control. Nothing that won't resolve with proper rest and moderate activity. The response satisfies Charles's mild concern, while deflecting any suggestion of serious illness that might require medical intervention. But Margaret understands that her window for maintaining this explanation grows smaller with each passing hour, as withdrawal symptoms intensify beyond her ability to disguise them through willpower and careful performance. Edmund spills marmalade on his school clothes, creating the kind of minor domestic crisis that normally would be resolved through calm maternal efficiency. But Margaret's compromised condition makes even simple problem-solving feel overwhelming. The sticky mess seems to spread with deliberate malice, while her shaking hands prove incapable of effective cleanup efforts. Charlotte notices her mother's unusual clumsiness with the sharp observation skills that children possess for detecting adult distress. Her questioning expression reveals awareness that something fundamental has changed in their family's morning dynamics, though she lacks the vocabulary to articulate her concerns. "Mama, are you feeling poorly?" Charlotte asks, with innocent directness that cuts through Margaret's carefully constructed facade. "You look rather pale, and your hands are shaking like grandmother's did when she was unwell." The comparison to Charles's elderly mother, who suffered from palsy during her final years, creates exactly the kind of medical speculation that Margaret desperately wants to avoid. Children's observations carry particular weight, because their lack of social sophistication prevents them from accepting polite explanations that adults might find satisfactory. "Just a bit tired, darling," Margaret manages, while attempting to steady her trembling hands through conscious effort that proves frustratingly ineffective. "Perhaps I'll rest after you and Edmund depart for your lessons." But rest offers no solution to Margaret's crisis, because her condition results from chemical absence rather than simple exhaustion. Sleep cannot provide the relief her body craves, and lying quietly in her bedroom will only intensify her awareness of symptoms that grow worse. With each passing hour, Mrs. Caldwell appears with the day's household agenda, expecting to receive clear instructions about meal planning, staff assignments, and preparation for tomorrow's social obligations. Her efficient competence assumes that Margaret will provide the kind of decisive leadership that has characterized their working relationship for over a decade. The housekeeper's detailed questions about menu selections and marketing budgets require cognitive processing that Margaret's compromised mental state cannot adequately provide. Simple decisions about which vegetables to serve with tomorrow's roast become overwhelming challenges that demand more mental energy than she possesses. "Perhaps we should postpone the Ashfords' dinner invitation until next week," Mrs. Caldwell suggests tactfully, after observing Margaret's unusual hesitation about routine household decisions. "You seem rather overwhelmed with recent social obligations." The observation contains enough truth to feel simultaneously helpful and threatening. Margaret desperately needs relief from upcoming social commitments that will require sustained performance beyond her current capabilities. But accepting such relief means acknowledging that something fundamental has changed in her ability to manage normal domestic responsibilities. "Yes, that seems wise," Margaret agrees, recognizing that she has no choice but to begin cancelling obligations that assume capabilities she no longer possesses. "Please send my regrets with appropriate explanations about temporary indisposition." The phrase "temporary indisposition" carries particular irony because Margaret understands that her condition may prove anything but temporary. Laudanum withdrawal can last for weeks, according to Dr. Hartwell's clinical descriptions, and she possesses no resources for managing such extended suffering while maintaining her family and social responsibilities. Charles departs for his banking offices with his usual kiss on Margaret's cheek, the brief physical contact revealing the fever-like temperature fluctuations that accompany her withdrawal symptoms. His familiar scent, normally comforting, now seems overwhelming to her hypersensitive nervous system. The children follow their father's departure with enthusiastic descriptions of the day's planned activities, their voices seeming unnaturally loud in Margaret's heightened auditory awareness. Every sound feels amplified beyond comfortable levels, from the scraping of chair legs against wooden floors to the rustling of newspaper pages. Left alone in the breakfast room, Margaret confronts the mathematical certainty of her situation with crystalline clarity that cuts through her physical discomfort. She possesses no laudanum and no legitimate means of obtaining more. Dr. Thornbury's growing suspicion makes requesting additional prescriptions increasingly dangerous. Alternative suppliers exist, but accessing them would require elaborate deceptions that her current condition makes nearly impossible to execute. Most terrifying of all, her withdrawal symptoms will continue intensifying for several more days before beginning their gradual retreat. She must somehow survive this extended period of suffering while maintaining enough functionality to prevent exposure of her condition to family members and household staff, whose discovery would destroy everything she has worked to preserve. The morning hours stretch ahead with their demands for continued performance in her roles as wife, mother, and household manager. Each responsibility requires capabilities that feel increasingly beyond her reach, as laudanum's absence creates chaos in every system of her body and mind. Margaret rises from the breakfast table with movements that require conscious coordination, her legs trembling beneath the weight of petticoats and moral obligation. The day ahead offers no respite from the requirements of Victorian respectability, but neither does it provide any resources for meeting those requirements without the chemical support that has become essential to her functioning. The woman who once believed laudanum would help her become a more capable version of herself must now discover whether any authentic capability remains beneath 3 years of chemical dependency. The answer will emerge through hours of suffering that will test every strategy she has developed for concealing her true condition from those whose judgment could destroy her family's future. As London awakens outside her windows, beginning another day of commerce and social obligation, Margaret prepares to face the greatest challenge of her life without the substance that has made previous challenges seem manageable. The reckoning she has avoided through months of careful supply management can no longer be postponed, and the hours ahead will determine whether her elaborate deceptions can survive the harsh reality of complete chemical withdrawal. The grandfather clock chimes 9 times, marking another hour survived and countless more that must be endured before her ordeal reaches its natural conclusion. But Margaret no longer possesses any certainty about what that conclusion might bring, except the knowledge that she cannot continue existing as she has for the past 3 years. The woman reflected in every mirror throughout the house has become a stranger whose capabilities depend entirely on substances she can no longer obtain. Today will begin the process of discovering who she actually is when stripped of chemical mediation, social performance, and the elaborate construction of respectability that has defined her identity as Victorian lady. The morning light streaming through lace curtains illuminates a life poised at the edge of complete transformation. Though whether that change will bring salvation or destruction remains as uncertain as Margaret's ability to survive the coming hours without the laudanum that has become more essential to her existence than breath itself. Itself. The hours crawl by with excruciating slowness as Margaret attempts to navigate the ordinary demands of Victorian domestic life while her body wages war against itself. By mid-morning, the tremors have intensified to the point where holding a teacup becomes an exercise in concentrated willpower, the delicate china rattling against the saucer like castanets in her unsteady grasp. She retreats to her private sitting room, ostensibly to attend to correspondence, but actually to escape the watchful eyes of servants who have begun to notice her deteriorating condition. The writing desk that once provided refuge for thoughtful letter composition now feels like an instrument of torture as she attempts to pen replies to social invitations with hands that refuse to obey her commands. The ink blots and shaky lettering that emerge from her efforts bear no resemblance to the elegant penmanship that has characterized her correspondence for years. Each stroke of the pen requires enormous concentration, and even then, the results appear as if written by someone in the throes of serious illness. She abandons the task after ruining 3 sheets of expensive stationery, each failed attempt a reminder of capabilities that have evaporated along with her chemical support system. Mary enters with tea service, her practiced efficiency masking growing concern about her mistress's condition. The silver tray trembles as she sets it down, not from her own nervousness, but from the vibrations created by Margaret's uncontrollable shaking. The aromatic steam rising from the teapot, normally a comfort, now triggers waves of nausea that force Margaret to press her handkerchief against her mouth. "Shall I send word to Master Charles at the bank?" Mary asks quietly, her professional discretion warring with genuine worry. "Perhaps he should return home to attend you properly." The suggestion terrifies Margaret more than her physical symptoms. Charles's presence would require sustained performance at precisely the moment when such deception becomes impossible. His businessman's eye for detail would detect inconsistencies that her usual explanations could not adequately address. Worse still, his concern might prompt him to summon medical attention that would expose everything she has fought to conceal. "That won't be necessary," Margaret manages through gritted teeth, each word requiring conscious effort to pronounce clearly. "I simply need quiet rest. Please ensure I'm not disturbed until the children return from their lessons." Oh! Mary's reluctant agreement comes with visible reservations, but she understands the hierarchy of domestic authority well enough to follow instructions despite her misgivings. After she departs, Margaret collapses into her reading chair with the relief of someone who has been holding a tremendous weight and finally allowed to set it down. But solitude brings no comfort when your enemy lives inside your own body. Without the distractions of social interaction, Margaret becomes acutely aware of every symptom ravaging her system. Her skin feels like it's been turned inside out, hypersensitive to the touch of fabric that once provided comfort. The room's temperature seems to fluctuate wildly, leaving her alternately shivering beneath heavy shawls and desperately fanning herself as fever-like heat courses through her veins. Time moves with the sluggish pace of honey in winter. Minutes feel like hours as Margaret watches the mantel clock's hands advance with agonizing slowness. Each chime marks another quarter hour survived, but also brings her closer to the children's return, when she must somehow transform back into the capable mother they expect to find waiting for them. The morning light shifts across the room's Persian carpet, creating patterns that seem to writhe and dance in ways that have nothing to do with actual shadows. Margaret's vision blurs intermittently, forcing her to blink rapidly to clear distortions that make familiar objects appear foreign and threatening. The beloved books lining her shelves seem to lean at impossible angles, their gilt lettering swimming like golden fish in an aquatic hallucination. Hunger remains completely absent despite having consumed almost nothing at breakfast. The mere thought of food triggers such violent nausea that Margaret must focus on slow, deliberate breathing to prevent actual vomiting that would be impossible to explain to household staff. Water provides the only tolerable sustenance, but even that simple liquid tastes metallic and strange, as if her body has forgotten how to process the most basic requirements for survival. The sounds of London life continue beyond her windows with cruel normalcy. Horse hooves clatter over cobblestones as merchants make their rounds. Street vendors call out their wares in voices that seem unnaturally amplified to Margaret's hypersensitive hearing. Church bells toll the hour with bronze reverberations that feel like physical blows against her skull. In her more lucid moments, Margaret attempts to formulate plans for obtaining relief from her condition. The obvious solution involves visiting Dr. Thornbury with complaints that would justify renewed laudanum prescriptions, but her appearance makes such deception increasingly dangerous. No respectable physician could examine her current state without recognizing symptoms that extend far beyond simple nervous exhaustion. Alternative medical practitioners exist in London's less fashionable districts, men who ask fewer questions and maintain looser standards about their patients' moral character. But accessing such resources would require elaborate explanations for her absence from home, transportation arrangements that avoid neighborhood observation, and financial transactions that leave no traceable records. Her current physical condition makes executing such complex deceptions nearly impossible. The illegal laudanum trade operates through networks that respectable women are not supposed to know exist. Certain public houses, gambling establishments, and boarding houses serve as distribution points for substances that medical authority has deemed inappropriate for general consumption. Margaret possesses theoretical knowledge of these alternatives through charitable work with unfortunate women, but practical access requires connections and courage that her sheltered existence has never provided. More troubling than the logistics of supply replacement is Margaret's growing recognition that her dependency has progressed beyond simple physical addiction. The laudanum has become the foundation for her entire identity as Victorian wife and mother. Without chemical enhancement, she cannot access the patience, energy, and emotional stability that effective domestic management requires. Her authentic self, whatever that might be, after 3 years of chemical mediation, feels completely inadequate for the responsibilities that define her social existence. The afternoon approaches with its promise of the children's return from their lessons. Edmund and Charlotte will burst through the front door with their usual enthusiasm, full of stories about their educational adventures and playground conflicts that require maternal wisdom for proper resolution. They will expect the kind of engaged attention that validates their importance in her life, while providing guidance for navigating childhood's complex social and emotional challenges. Margaret understands that she cannot provide such parenting while battling withdrawal symptoms that make basic conversation feel overwhelming. Yet disappointing her children carries consequences that extend beyond immediate emotional harm. Edmund and Charlotte serve as witnesses whose observations could expose her condition to Charles if they report unusual maternal behavior during his evening return from business obligations. The sound of familiar voices in the front hallway announces their arrival with the precision of a well-wound chronometer. Margaret forces herself upright in her chair, attempting to arrange her features into expressions of maternal welcome, despite the enormous effort required for such basic social performance. The sitting room door opens to admit two small figures whose innocent expectations feel like crushing weights upon her compromised capabilities. "Mama, look what I learned today," Charlotte exclaims with 8-year-old excitement, brandishing a slate covered with mathematical calculations that represent her afternoon's academic achievements. Her bright eyes search Margaret's face for the praise and engagement that usually greet such scholarly accomplishments. Edmund follows with his own educational trophies, Latin vocabulary words that he recites with careful pronunciation while watching for maternal approval. His earnest desire for recognition creates emotional demands that Margaret's current condition cannot adequately satisfy, though she recognizes that failure to respond appropriately will create confusion and disappointment that could have lasting consequences. "Very impressive, darling," Margaret manages, her voice emerging as a hoarse whisper that bears little resemblance to her usual maternal tones. The words feel disconnected from any genuine emotional response, delivered through sheer force of will rather than authentic pride in her children's accomplishments. Both children notice the change immediately, with the sharp observational skills that make them such effective detectors of adult distress. Charlotte tilts her head with the curious expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle, while Edmund's brow furrows with concern that seems far too mature for his 8 years. "Are you quite ill, Mama?" Edmund asks with the careful politeness of a child who has been taught to show proper concern for adult welfare. "You sound rather strange, and you're shaking like the leaves outside when the wind blows hard." The comparison to autumn foliage provides an unfortunately accurate description of Margaret's uncontrollable tremors. Her hands flutter against her skirts with involuntary movements that no amount of conscious effort can completely suppress. The children's innocent observations cut through her attempts at concealment with devastating precision. "Just a touch of fatigue, my dears," she replies, while attempting to still her trembling hands through sheer willpower. "Perhaps you could play quietly in the nursery while Mama rests a bit longer." The suggestion disappoints them visibly, but their training in proper behavior toward indisposed adults prevents open protests. They retreat with obvious reluctance, leaving Margaret alone with the knowledge that her maternal failures are accumulating with each interaction that falls short of their reasonable expectations for engaged parenting. The afternoon stretches endlessly as Margaret alternates between periods of restless agitation and exhausted collapse. Sleep remains impossible despite her body's desperate need for rest, because withdrawal symptoms create a state of hyper-alertness that makes relaxation unattainable. Her mind races with chaotic thoughts that jump between practical concerns about supply replacement and deeper questions about the authentic self that might exist beneath 3 years of chemical dependency. The grandfather clock chimes 4 times, marking another hour survived in what feels like an endless endurance test. Each passing minute brings her closer to Charles's evening return, when she must somehow transform into the competent wife whose domestic management skills justify his confidence in their household arrangements. Evening meals require orchestrating complex service coordination, while participating in family conversations about the day's events. Charles will expect updates about social obligations, household expenditures, and domestic staff performance. The children will need guidance about tomorrow's lessons and resolution of any conflicts that arose during their afternoon activities. Most challenging of all, Margaret must accomplish these family leadership responsibilities while battling symptoms that make sustained attention nearly impossible. The laudanum absence has created cognitive fog that prevents her from processing complex information or making decisions that require consideration of multiple variables simultaneously. Mrs. Caldwell appears with questions about tomorrow's marketing needs and staff assignments, her professional efficiency assuming that Margaret will provide the clear direction that household management requires. But simple decisions about menu planning and budget allocation feel overwhelming when filtered through withdrawal symptoms that distort her ability to evaluate priorities and consequences. Perhaps we should serve yesterday's remaining roast as cold cuts for tomorrow's luncheon, the housekeeper suggests tactfully, after observing Margaret's unusual hesitation about routine domestic choices. That would reduce the marketing requirements and simplify the kitchen preparations. The recommendation provides welcome relief from decision-making demands, while also highlighting how obviously Margaret's capabilities have deteriorated. Mrs. Caldwell's diplomatic accommodation suggests growing awareness that something fundamental has changed in her mistress's ability to manage normal household responsibilities. Yes, that sounds perfectly reasonable. Margaret agrees with gratitude that extends beyond the specific suggestion to include the housekeeper's tactful handling of her obvious limitations. Please proceed with whatever arrangements seem most practical for the staff's convenience. The delegation represents both necessary adaptation to her current condition and dangerous precedent that could attract unwanted attention from Charles if he notices that household management decisions are being made by staff rather than his wife. Victorian husbands expect their domestic arrangements to flow from female oversight, not servant initiative, regardless of the practical effectiveness of such delegation. As evening approaches with its promise of family dinner and required social performance, Margaret faces the prospect of her most challenging deception. Yet, she must appear at the dining table looking fresh and capable. Despite having spent the day battling symptoms that have grown progressively worse, Charles and the children will expect the kind of engaging conversation and attentive presence that defines successful family interaction in their social class. The elaborate process of evening dress preparation begins with Mary's assistance. Though both women understand they are attempting to create an illusion that may prove impossible to maintain. The elegant gown and careful grooming can conceal many symptoms, but they cannot restore the cognitive clarity and emotional stability that effective family leadership requires. Margaret studies her reflection in the dressing table mirror with the detached fascination of someone observing a stranger. The woman staring back possesses all the external markers of Victorian respectability, but her eyes reveal a desperation that no amount of cosmetic artistry can completely disguise. She has become expert at wearing the costume of normalcy while being anything but normal beneath its carefully constructed surface. The dinner bell chimes downstairs, summoning the family to their evening meal with the same punctuality that has governed their domestic routines for 8 years. But tonight, that familiar sound carries the weight of ultimate test for Margaret's ability to maintain deceptions that have become increasingly difficult to sustain. She descends the staircase with careful deliberation, gripping the banister with desperate intensity while projecting the graceful confidence that family dinner requires. Each step downward brings her closer to a performance that will determine whether her elaborate construction of chemical dependency and social respectability can survive another day of increasing strain. The dining room awaits with its familiar comforts and crushing expectations, where she must somehow transform from invalid into wife and mother through sheer force of will and 3 years of practice at concealing the most shameful secret of her carefully regulated existence. The dining room's warm gaslight casts deceptive comfort across familiar surroundings that now feel like a stage set for Margaret's most demanding performance. Charles sits at his customary place, unfolding his evening newspaper with the satisfied air of a man whose day concluded profitably. The children arrange themselves with practiced precision, their faces bright with anticipation for the family conversations that punctuate their evening routine. Margaret takes her seat with movements calculated to appear natural despite the tremendous effort required for each gesture. Her hands find refuge in her lap, hidden beneath the tablecloth where their violent trembling cannot betray her condition. The elaborate place setting before her seems to mock her incapacity, each piece of silverware representing another challenge to her deteriorating motor control. "You look rather improved this evening, my dear," Charles observes with the casual attention of someone whose concern has been satisfied by surface appearances. I trust the afternoon's rest proved beneficial for whatever malady was troubling you. His words carry the comfortable assumption that Margaret's mysterious illness has resolved itself through proper feminine recuperation. Victorian gentlemen possess limited patience for prolonged female indisposition, expecting their wives to recover promptly from whatever delicate conditions might temporarily impair their domestic efficiency. "Yes, much better," Margaret replies, amazed that her voice emerges without obvious tremor, despite the enormous concentration required for speech control. Simply a touch of nervous exhaustion that rest has largely remedied. The explanation satisfies Charles's mild curiosity while establishing expectations for renewed domestic competence that Margaret knows she cannot fulfill. But maintaining this fiction feels less important than surviving the next hour without exposing symptoms that would raise questions beyond her ability to answer convincingly. Cook's first course arrives with its usual presentation of seasonal soup, served in delicate china bowls that require steady hands for graceful consumption. Margaret stares at the golden liquid with growing dread, understanding that eating represents another test of capabilities that laudanum withdrawal has severely compromised. Edmund launches into enthusiastic descriptions of his afternoon mathematics lesson, his young voice carrying across the dining room with energy that seems unnaturally amplified to Margaret's hypersensitive hearing. Each word strikes her consciousness with painful clarity, while demanding maternal responses that require mental processing she can barely manage. Master Harrison says, "I'm progressing remarkably well with algebraic concepts." Edmund continues, with obvious pride. "He believes I might advance to more sophisticated mathematical principles next term if I maintain current study habits." The academic achievement deserves genuine maternal celebration, but Margaret finds herself struggling to access appropriate emotional responses through the fog of withdrawal symptoms. Her pride in Edmund's accomplishments feels filtered through layers of chemical absence that prevent authentic connection with his success. "That's wonderful, darling," she manages while attempting to lift her spoon with hands that shake like autumn leaves. "Your father and I are very proud of your dedication to scholarly excellence." Charles beams with paternal satisfaction that assumes Margaret's response reflects genuine engagement rather than desperate performance. His confidence in their family's educational progress creates additional pressure for sustained attention that her current condition makes nearly impossible to provide. Charlotte contributes her own academic updates with 8-year-old enthusiasm that demands equal maternal recognition. Her recitation of French vocabulary words requires corrections and encouragement that test Margaret's ability to access knowledge through withdrawal-induced cognitive impairment. The simple act of consuming soup becomes an elaborate choreography of concealment as Margaret attempts to navigate liquid to her mouth without revealing the tremors that make every gesture unpredictable. She manages small sips between conversational contributions, grateful that the warm broth provides some relief for her increasingly sensitive digestive system. Mrs. Pemberton inquired about our Christmas entertaining plans during her afternoon visit, Charles mentions, while cutting his meat with practiced precision. "I assured her that you would coordinate the usual holiday gatherings with your customary excellence." The casual reference to future social obligations strikes terror into Margaret's already racing heart. Christmas entertaining requires weeks of advanced planning, sustained energy for elaborate preparations, and the kind of gracious hostess performance that her current condition makes unthinkable. Yet refusing such traditional responsibilities would create exactly the kind of speculation she desperately needs to avoid. "Certainly," she agrees with false confidence, while privately calculating whether she will survive the next week, much less manage holiday celebrations that assume capabilities she no longer possesses. "I'll begin coordinating arrangements once this temporary indisposition completely resolves." The temporal qualifier provides potential escape from commitments that may prove impossible to fulfill, but it also establishes expectations for rapid recovery that could become problematic if her withdrawal symptoms persist, as long as medical literature suggests they might. Mary appears to clear the soup course, her trained eyes noting the barely touched bowl that reveals Margaret's inability to consume normal portions. The maid's expression carries subtle concern that goes beyond professional attention to proper service, suggesting growing awareness that her mistress's condition extends beyond simple temporary illness. The meat course presents even greater challenges as Charles carves the roast with ceremonial precision that demonstrates his role as family patriarch. The rich aromas that once stimulated appetite now trigger waves of nausea that force Margaret to breathe carefully through her mouth to prevent visible retching. "I encountered Harrison Whitfield at the club today," Charles continues with the comfortable rhythm of someone sharing his day's experiences with interested family members. "He mentioned certain investment opportunities in South African mining ventures that merit serious consideration." Financial discussions require Margaret to appear knowledgeable about household economics while battling cognitive fog that makes processing complex information nearly impossible. She nods at appropriate intervals while privately focusing all her energy on preventing her wine glass from slipping through trembling fingers. The children's chatter creates a constant background of noise that feels overwhelming to Margaret's hypersensitive nervous system. Every laugh seems too loud, every question demands more mental energy than she possesses, and every expectation for maternal guidance weighs like physical pressure against her compromised capabilities. "Mama seems rather quiet tonight," Charlotte observes with the direct honesty that makes children such effective detectors of adult distress. "Are you quite certain you're feeling better? You haven't eaten very much, and you keep staring at your plate rather strangely." The innocent observation cuts through Margaret's careful facade with devastating accuracy. Charlotte's comment draws attention to behavioural changes that Margaret hoped would pass unnoticed, creating exactly the kind of family scrutiny that could lead to unwanted medical intervention. "Just thoughtful about tomorrow's responsibilities, darling," Margaret replies, while attempting to take a bite of meat that tastes like sawdust in her mouth. Sometimes adult concerns require considerable mental attention that might appear distracted to young observers. The explanation satisfies Charlotte's curiosity, while deflecting attention from symptoms that grow more difficult to conceal with each passing hour. But Margaret recognizes that her window for maintaining these deceptions continues shrinking, as withdrawal effects intensify beyond her ability to manage through willpower alone. Charles discusses his banking colleagues with enthusiasm that assumes Margaret's continued interest in his professional advancement. His descriptions of office politics and financial strategies require engaged responses that demonstrate wifely support for his career ambitions. But her capacity for such sustained attention feels frustratingly elusive. The dining room's gaslight flickers slightly, creating shadows that seem to dance with unnatural movement in Margaret's distorted peripheral vision. The familiar room appears foreign and threatening, as withdrawal symptoms affect her visual processing in ways that make even comfortable surroundings seem alien and dangerous. Edmund asks for guidance about a playground dispute that requires diplomatic maternal wisdom for proper resolution. His earnest request for adult intervention in childhood conflicts normally would engage Margaret's protective instincts, but her current condition makes providing nuanced parenting advice feel overwhelming. "Perhaps you could discuss your concerns with your father," she suggests, with guilt that compounds her existing distress. "He possesses excellent judgment about handling interpersonal difficulties with classmates." The delegation disappoints Edmund visibly, while also creating potential complications if Charles notices that his wife is avoiding traditional maternal responsibilities. Victorian fathers expect their wives to manage children's emotional needs, while they focus on financial and disciplinary matters that require masculine authority. Dessert service brings relief that the meal approaches its conclusion. Though Margaret understands that surviving dinner represents only one challenge in an evening that will test every strategy she has developed for concealing her true condition, after-dinner family time requires sustained engagement with domestic responsibilities that assume capabilities she no longer possesses. The children's bedtime routines demand maternal oversight of washing, prayers, and story reading that provide essential emotional security for their developing sense of family stability. Margaret must somehow transform from invalid into nurturing mother through sheer force of will and years of practice at performing roles. Her authentic self can no longer fulfill. Charles expects post-dinner conversation about household matters, social obligations, and intimate partnership that defines successful Victorian marriage. His anticipation of continued domestic competence assumes that Margaret's afternoon indisposition has resolved itself sufficiently to restore normal marital interaction. But the woman sitting at the dining table bears only superficial resemblance to the capable wife and mother whose identity has been constructed around chemical enhancement of her natural abilities. Without Laudanum's support, Margaret feels like an actress playing roles she no longer understands, delivering lines that feel disconnected from any authentic emotional experience. The grandfather clock chimes 8 times, marking another hour survived in what feels like an endless endurance test of deception and performance. Each passing minute brings new challenges that require resources she no longer possesses, forcing her to discover whether 3 years of chemical dependency have left any genuine capabilities intact beneath the elaborate construction of pharmaceutical assistance. As the family prepares to transition from dining room to drawing room for evening activities that assume continued maternal participation, Margaret faces the prospect of extended social performance, while battling symptoms that grow more severe with each passing hour. The evening stretches ahead with its demands for sustained family leadership, at precisely the moment when such responsibilities feel most impossible to fulfill. The woman who once took laudanum to enhance her capabilities as Victorian wife and mother must now confront the terrifying possibility that those capabilities exist only through chemical mediation. Tonight, we'll test whether any authentic strength remains beneath 3 years of dependency that has transformed medicine into the foundation for her entire social existence. Rising from the dinner table requires conscious coordination of movements that once flowed automatically, each gesture demanding deliberate control over limbs that no longer obey her conscious commands reliably. Margaret grips her chair back with desperate intensity while projecting the graceful confidence that family evening activities require. The drawing room awaits with its comfortable furniture and crushing expectations, where she must somehow maintain the illusion of domestic competence, while her body wages increasingly desperate war against the absence of substances that have become more essential to her functioning than food, sleep, or honest human connection. The evening light fades outside the windows as London settles into nighttime routines that assume the continuation of normal family life within the Whitmore household. But Margaret understands that nothing about her existence remains normal, and the hours ahead will determine whether her elaborate deceptions can survive the harsh reality of complete chemical withdrawal, combined with unrelenting social obligations. The parlour's familiar warmth feels simultaneously comforting and threatening as Margaret settles into her customary chair near the fireplace, its upholstered arms providing necessary support for her increasingly unreliable physical coordination. Charles arranges himself with his evening pipe and financial journals, while the children spread their books across the Persian carpet for the quiet study time that precedes their bedtime routines. This domestic tableau represents everything Margaret once cherished about her role as wife and mother. The peaceful evening hours when her family gathered in comfortable intimacy, sharing the day's experiences while preparing for tomorrow's challenges. Such moments had provided genuine satisfaction before laudanum transformed her authentic engagement into chemical performance that grows more difficult to maintain with each passing hour. Edmund struggles with Latin conjugations that require maternal assistance, his young brow furrowed with concentration as he attempts to master declensions that seem designed to confuse rather than educate. His frustrated sighs create emotional demands for encouraging guidance that Margaret recognizes she should provide. But accessing patience and pedagogical wisdom through withdrawal symptoms feels nearly impossible. "Mama, could you help me understand why these word endings change so drastically?" he asks, with the trusting expectation that maternal knowledge will resolve his academic confusion. Master Harrison's explanations make sense during lessons, but reviewing them alone proves rather challenging. The request represents exactly the kind of intellectual partnership that effective parenting requires, but Margaret's compromised cognitive state makes processing complex grammatical concepts feel overwhelming. The Latin rules that once seemed straightforward now blur together in confusion that mirrors her internal chaos. Perhaps we could review your lesson materials together after your sister completes her reading assignment, she suggests, with hope that delayed assistance might prove more manageable than immediate tutoring. Sometimes concepts become clearer when approached with fresh attention rather than forced understanding. Edmund accepts this postponement with visible disappointment that adds guilt to Margaret's existing emotional burden. Her son deserves the kind of engaged academic support that his educational progress requires, but providing such assistance demands mental clarity that laudanum withdrawal has temporarily eliminated. Charlotte curls in her favorite corner with a storybook whose illustrations capture her complete attention, her young imagination transported to fictional worlds that seem more appealing than the increasingly tense domestic reality surrounding her. Her peaceful absorption provides temporary relief from maternal demands, while also highlighting the stark contrast between childhood innocence and adult complexity. Charles discusses his banking concerns with the comfortable assumption that Margaret will provide interested responses to his professional observations. His descriptions of currency fluctuations and investment strategies require the kind of sophisticated economic understanding that their marriage has always assumed she possesses through intelligent wifely engagement. The South African mining ventures. Harrison mentioned present intriguing possibilities, he continues, while tamping tobacco into his pipe bowl. Initial capital requirements seem reasonable considering potential returns, though political stability remains somewhat uncertain given colonial developments. Financial discussions that once stimulated Margaret's intellectual curiosity now feel like foreign languages requiring translation she cannot provide. The economic concepts float past her compromised consciousness without engaging genuine understanding or generating meaningful responses that Charles's confidence in her judgment assumes she can offer. Such decisions require careful consideration of multiple variables. She manages while hoping that generic wisdom might substitute for specific analysis. Her current condition makes impossible. Perhaps additional research would clarify whether potential benefits justify inherent risks. The response satisfies Charles's need for wifely consultation, while avoiding commitments to detailed economic evaluation that her withdrawal symptoms make unthinkable. But such diplomatic evasions establish patterns of intellectual disengagement that could become problematic if her condition persists beyond the temporary indisposition she has claimed. The fire crackles in the hearth with sounds that seem unnaturally amplified to Margaret's hypersensitive hearing, each spark and ember creating auditory assaults that feel like physical blows against her skull. The room's comfortable warmth fluctuates unpredictably in her perception, leaving her alternately shivering beneath heavy shawls and desperately fanning herself with the delicate ivory fan that has become essential equipment for managing temperature dysregulation. Mary appears with tea service, her efficient movements suggesting routine domestic normalcy, while her concerned glances toward Margaret reveal growing awareness that something fundamental has changed in the household's evening rhythms. The silver tray trembles slightly as she arranges cups and saucers, though whether from her own nervousness or vibrations created by Margaret's uncontrollable shaking remains unclear. The aromatic steam rising from the teapot triggers immediate nausea that forces Margaret to press her handkerchief against her mouth, with movements she hopes appear related to delicate feminine sensibilities, rather than desperate attempts to prevent visible retching. Tea service represents another test of social capabilities that withdrawal symptoms have severely compromised. "Shall I prepare the children's bedtime preparations, ma'am?" Mary asks with tactful attention to household routines that assume Margaret will provide supervisory oversight for evening rituals that ensure proper childhood development through consistent parental engagement. The suggestion offers welcome relief from immediate performance demands, while also highlighting how obviously Margaret's maternal capabilities have deteriorated throughout the day. Her inability to manage basic parenting responsibilities without staff assistance represents dangerous precedent that could attract unwanted attention from Charles if he recognizes that childcare decisions are being made by servants rather than their mother. Yes, that would be helpful, Margaret agrees with gratitude that extends beyond specific assistance to include Mary's diplomatic handling of her obvious limitations. Please ensure they complete their washing thoroughly and say proper prayers before sleep. Charlotte approaches with her completed reading assignment, seeking maternal approval for academic accomplishments that deserve genuine celebration, rather than the hollow praise that Margaret's current condition allows her to provide. The child's bright expectation for engaged parental response creates emotional demands that feel overwhelming, despite their fundamental importance for healthy development. I finished the entire story about the princess who rescued herself from the tower. Charlotte announces with 8-year-old pride that assumes maternal interest will match her own enthusiasm for fictional heroines who demonstrate feminine capability and independence. The irony of Charlotte's story selection strikes Margaret with painful awareness of her own imprisonment in chemical dependency that has transformed her from capable woman into someone whose existence revolves around substances she can no longer obtain. The fictional princess's self-rescue seems impossibly remote from Margaret's reality of increasing helplessness. "How wonderful, darling," she responds, while attempting to access genuine maternal pride through layers of withdrawal symptoms that create barriers between intention and authentic emotional expression. Such stories demonstrate that intelligence and determination often prove more valuable than waiting for external rescue. The moral lesson emerges from some surviving fragment of her authentic self, though delivering it requires enormous effort that leaves Margaret feeling drained by the simple act of providing appropriate maternal guidance. Every interaction with her children demands resources she no longer possesses, while highlighting the growing gap between their needs and her capabilities. Edmund finally conquers his Latin exercises with assistance from Charles, who demonstrates the kind of patient tutorial engagement that effective parenting requires. His success creates demands for maternal recognition that Margaret struggles to provide through cognitive fog that makes processing his academic achievement feel nearly impossible. The children's bedtime preparations proceed with Mary's supervision, while Margaret remains in her chair, ostensibly reviewing household accounts, but actually focusing all her energy on maintaining enough composure to bid them proper good night when they return for final maternal blessing before sleep. Their reappearance in nightgowns and slippers creates the evening's most challenging performance requirement, as both children seek the kind of nurturing attention that provides essential emotional security for childhood development. Edmund's request for story reading and Charlotte's need for bedtime prayers demands sustained maternal engagement that feels completely beyond Margaret's current capabilities. "Perhaps Papa could provide tonight's story," Margaret suggests, with guilt that compounds her existing distress about failing to meet her children's reasonable expectations for consistent parental attention. "I'm feeling rather tired this evening and fear I might not do justice to proper narrative presentation." The disappointment in their faces reveals how significantly her withdrawal from maternal duties has affected their sense of family stability. Children depend on predictable parental involvement for emotional security, and Margaret's increasing inability to provide such consistency creates confusion that could have lasting psychological consequences. Charles steps into the parental breach with good-natured efficiency that masks his growing concern about Margaret's unusual disengagement from family responsibilities. His willingness to assume additional childcare duties provides necessary relief while also establishing precedent for altered domestic arrangements that could become problematic if her condition persists. After the children's departure for sleep, the drawing room settles into intimate quiet that assumes renewed marital connection between husband and wife, whose evening conversations traditionally provide essential communication about family concerns and personal observations. Charles expects the kind of engaged partnership that defines successful Victorian marriage. But Margaret feels like an imposter wearing his wife's clothing, while lacking any of her authentic capabilities for genuine human connection. The laudanum absence has created emotional barriers that prevent her from accessing the warmth, intelligence, and companionship that their relationship has always assumed she would provide through natural wifely affection. "You seem rather distant this evening, my dear," Charles observes with gentle concern that reflects genuine worry rather than critical judgment. "I trust this afternoon's indisposition hasn't developed into something more serious that might require medical attention." The suggestion of doctor involvement strikes terror into Margaret's already racing heart, because professional medical examination would reveal symptoms that could not be explained by any respectable illness. Her condition would expose the chemical dependency she has fought so desperately to conceal, destroying not only her reputation, but Charles's business prospects and their children's social futures. "Simply lingering fatigue that proper rest will resolve completely," she replies with false confidence, while privately recognizing that her withdrawal symptoms will likely intensify over the coming days before beginning any gradual improvement. Nothing that warrants medical intervention for such temporary discomfort. Charles accepts her explanation with the trusting assumption that his wife possesses sufficient self-knowledge to evaluate her own health accurately. His masculine discomfort with feminine medical mysteries makes him reluctant to press concerns that might venture into territory better left to female discretion and professional medical authority. The evening's final challenge arrives as Charles prepares for their private marital moments that Victorian couples conduct behind closed doors with discretion that protects intimate partnership from public observation. He expects the kind of physical and emotional availability that defines successful matrimonial relationships. Margaret recognizes that her current condition makes such intimate connection impossible without revealing symptoms that would raise questions beyond her ability to answer. Convincingly, the withdrawal effects have created hypersensitivity that makes even gentle touch feel painful, while emotional barriers prevent authentic response to physical affection. "Perhaps we might postpone intimate conversation until I've recovered more completely from today's malaise," she suggests, with hope that delayed expectations might prove more manageable than immediate performance demands. "I fear I'm not quite myself this evening and would prefer to wait until I can provide proper wifely attention." The postponement disappoints Charles visibly, while also creating potential complications if Margaret's condition prevents normal marital relations for the extended period that withdrawal symptoms typically require. Victorian husbands possess limited patience for prolonged feminine indisposition that interferes with established matrimonial expectations. As the household settles into nighttime quiet, Margaret faces the prospect of attempting sleep while battling symptoms that make rest impossible, despite her body's desperate need for recuperation. The darkness brings no relief from withdrawal effects that intensify during hours when chemical absence becomes most apparent to nervous systems accustomed to regular pharmaceutical support. The bedroom that once provided refuge from daily pressures now feels like a prison where she must endure hours of increasing discomfort while maintaining enough composure to avoid attracting attention from Charles, whose proximity makes concealing her condition exponentially more difficult. Margaret lies motionless beside her sleeping husband while her body wages increasingly desperate war against laudanum absence, every nerve ending screaming in rebellion against the chemical void that has replaced 3 years of pharmaceutical dependence. The night stretches endlessly ahead, with promises of sleeplessness and escalating symptoms that will test every strategy she has developed for maintaining deceptions that grow more precarious with each passing hour. Tomorrow will bring renewed demands for domestic competence and social performance, while her withdrawal symptoms reach their peak intensity, forcing her to discover whether any authentic strength remains beneath the elaborate construction of chemical dependency that has defined her existence as Victorian wife and mother. The woman who once believed laudanum would enhance her capabilities must now confront the terrifying possibility that those capabilities exist only through pharmaceutical mediation, leaving her to face life's challenges with resources she can no longer access through substances that have become more essential to her functioning than consciousness itself. The grandfather clock strikes 2 in the morning, each chime reverberating through Margaret's skull like hammer blows against an anvil. Sleep remains a cruel impossibility as her nervous system rebels with increasing violence against the chemical void that has replaced 3 years of pharmaceutical dependence. Every position becomes unbearable within minutes, her hypersensitive skin reacting to the finest linen sheets as if they were woven from nettles and thorns. Charles sleeps peacefully beside her, his steady breathing a maddening reminder of the normal rest that her body can no longer achieve. She envies his unconscious tranquility while simultaneously fearing that her violent tremors might wake him and force explanations she cannot provide. The elaborate performance of marital normalcy requires even her suffering to remain silent and invisible. The darkness transforms familiar bedroom objects into threatening shapes that seem to shift and writhe in her peripheral vision. The wardrobe looms like a giant coffin, while the dressing table mirror reflects distorted images that bear no resemblance to the woman she once knew herself to be. Even closing her eyes provides no escape, as vivid hallucinations play behind her eyelids with the intensity of fever dreams. Her skin alternates between burning fever and bone-deep chills that no amount of blankets can warm. Perspiration soaks through her nightgown despite the room's cool temperature, while her hands and feet feel like blocks of ice that will never regain circulation. The chemical withdrawal has created chaos in every system of her body, turning basic physiological functions into sources of torment. By 4 o'clock, Margaret abandons any pretense of sleep and retreats to her sitting room, where she can pace frantically without disturbing Charles's rest. The Persian carpet muffles her footsteps as she walks endless circuits around furniture that seems to mock her with its stability and permanence. Everything in her world has become unreliable, except the relentless progression of symptoms that grow worse with each passing hour. The morning sun creeps through heavy curtains with the inevitability of execution, bringing another day of responsibilities that feel impossible to fulfill. Margaret stares at her reflection in the sitting room mirror and sees a stranger whose hollow eyes speak of battles being fought and lost behind a facade of Victorian respectability. The woman looking back has become expert at wearing the costume of normalcy while being anything but normal beneath its carefully maintained surface. Mary's gentle knock arrives with clockwork precision, announcing the beginning of another day's elaborate deception. Margaret forces herself to respond with something resembling her usual voice, though the sound emerges as a hoarse whisper that bears no resemblance to the cultured tones her lady's maid expects to hear. The morning ablutions become exercises in controlled terror as Margaret attempts to wash and dress while her hands shake so violently that holding a washcloth requires enormous concentration. Mary's increasingly worried expressions reveal that even the most diplomatic servant cannot ignore symptoms that grow more obvious with each interaction. "Perhaps I should prepare a lighter breakfast this morning, ma'am," Mary suggests, with the careful neutrality of someone walking through a minefield of social propriety, something that might be easier on a delicate constitution during recovery from yesterday's malaise. The euphemism provides face-saving explanation for Margaret's obvious inability to consume normal portions, but it also establishes expectations for continued illness that could become problematic if her condition persists for the weeks that medical literature suggests laudanum withdrawal typically requires. Breakfast presents the same torturous challenges as yesterday, but intensified by another night without chemical support, and Charles's growing attention to behavioral changes that no amount of careful performance can completely disguise. His businessman's eye for detail has begun noticing inconsistencies that her usual explanations struggle to address convincingly. "I think perhaps we should summon Dr. Thornbury," Charles announces with the decisive authority of someone accustomed to solving problems through direct action. This lingering indisposition seems rather more serious than simple nervous exhaustion, and professional medical attention might prevent whatever condition you're experiencing from developing into something genuinely dangerous. The words strike Margaret with the force of a physical blow, because Dr. Thornbury's examination would expose everything she has fought so desperately to conceal. His medical training would recognize withdrawal symptoms immediately, leading to questions about medication use that would destroy not only her reputation, but the carefully constructed foundation of their entire family's social standing. "I'm certain that's unnecessary," she manages through gritted teeth, while attempting to steady her coffee cup with hands that refuse to cooperate. These feminine complaints often resolve themselves through proper rest and moderate activity rather than medical intervention. But Charles's expression reveals growing skepticism about her self-diagnosis, and Margaret realizes that her window for maintaining this deception may be measured in hours rather than days. The elaborate performance that once seemed sustainable has become impossible to continue without the chemical support that transformed her from invalid into accomplished Victorian lady. The morning stretches endlessly as Margaret attempts to navigate household responsibilities while battling symptoms that make basic concentration nearly impossible. Every decision requires enormous mental effort, from selecting menus to approving expenditures, while Mrs. Caldwell's increasingly frequent suggestions reveal that even the household staff recognizes her deteriorating capabilities. By noon, Margaret understands that she faces a choice between two equally terrifying alternatives. She can confess her dependency to Charles and face the social destruction that such revelation would inevitably bring, or she can attempt to obtain laudanum through means that would compromise every moral principle she once held sacred. The illegal trade in pharmaceutical substances operates through networks that respectable women are never supposed to acknowledge, much less access. But Margaret's desperation has reached levels that make previously unthinkable options seem like reasonable solutions to problems that conventional approaches cannot address. The afternoon brings her to a decision that would have horrified the woman she was 3 years ago. Disguised in her plainest dress and darkest veil, Margaret ventures into London's less fashionable districts, where moral boundaries blur and substances flow to anyone willing to pay the asking price. The boarding house on Drury Lane looks innocuous enough from the outside, its peeling paint and grimy windows indistinguishable from dozens of other establishments that cater to London's working classes. But Margaret knows from her charitable work that certain rooms within serve purposes that have nothing to do with providing temporary accommodation for honest labourers. Her knock on the back door produces a suspicious face that evaluates her appearance with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to unusual requests from unexpected visitors. Money changes hands with efficiency that suggests well-established procedures for serving customers whose needs extend beyond legal pharmaceutical options. The brown bottle she receives contains liquid that looks identical to the laudanum prescribed by Dr. Thornbury, but its provenance makes it infinitely more dangerous to her reputation and social standing. Purchasing medicine through illegal channels transforms her from respectable patient into criminal participant in trade networks that Victorian society views with moral horror. But as Margaret measures her first dose in 3 days, such concerns feel trivial compared to the immediate relief that floods through her tortured nervous system. The familiar bitter taste brings blessed cessation of symptoms that had pushed her beyond the limits of human endurance. Within minutes, the tremors subside, the nausea recedes, and the crushing weight of reality lifts enough to make continued existence seem possible. The transformation is so complete that Margaret almost weeps with gratitude for the chemical salvation that restores her ability to function as wife, mother, and Victorian lady. But even as relief washes over her, she recognizes that this solution creates new problems that may prove more dangerous than the withdrawal symptoms it temporarily resolves. Her supplier operates outside legal medical authority, making future access dependent on criminal connections that could expose her to blackmail, arrest, or worse. The quality and potency of illegal laudanum varies unpredictably, creating risks of accidental overdose or inadequate relief that legitimate medical practice would never allow. Most troubling of all, Margaret realizes that her dependency has progressed beyond simple physical addiction to encompass complete reliance on substances that she must now obtain through means that violate every moral principle her social class holds sacred. The respectable woman who once took prescribed medicine to enhance her domestic capabilities has become someone whose existence depends on criminal transactions in London's most dangerous neighbourhoods. Returning home with her precious supply, Margaret resumes her roles as wife and mother with the fluid grace that chemical support makes possible. Charles notices her improved appearance immediately, his relief at her apparent recovery masking any questions about the miraculous speed of her transformation from invalid to accomplished hostess. The children greet her renewed attention with enthusiasm that breaks Margaret's heart, because she understands that their mother's love now depends entirely on her ability to maintain access to substances that exist outside every legal and moral boundary their society recognizes. Their innocent trust in maternal stability rests on foundations built from criminal activity and pharmaceutical dependency. Evening dinner proceeds with the elegant normalcy that laudanum makes possible, but Margaret's awareness of the illegal source supporting her performance adds new dimensions of guilt and fear to the elaborate deception she must maintain. Every gracious gesture, every intelligent conversation, and every demonstration of domestic competence now represents the fruits of criminal enterprise that could destroy everything she has worked to preserve. As London settles into nighttime quiet outside her windows, Margaret counts the doses remaining in her illegally obtained supply and calculates how long she can maintain her restored functionality before facing another crisis of chemical absence. The mathematics of addiction admit no negotiation, and her dependency will require increasingly frequent transactions with criminal networks that grow more dangerous with each contact. The woman who began taking laudanum to become a better version of herself has discovered that such improvement demands constant compromise of the moral principles that once defined her character. Each dose restores her capabilities while simultaneously destroying her authentic self beneath layers of chemical dependency and criminal complicity. But tonight, with laudanum flowing through her veins and her family safely unaware of the price she pays for their domestic tranquility, Margaret allows herself to experience the temporary peace that makes continued existence possible. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and renewed demands for the chemical support that has become more essential to her functioning than honesty, morality, or genuine human connection. The grandfather clock chimes midnight as Margaret prepares for sleep that laudanum will finally allow, though she understands that rest brings her closer to the next crisis of supply and the increasingly desperate measures such crises will demand. The Victorian woman who once believed medicine would enhance her life has learned that some enhancements become prisons from which escape grows more impossible with each passing day. And there, in the amber glow of gaslight filtering through London's perpetual fog, we leave Margaret Whitmore clutching her illegal salvation while the grandfather clock marks another midnight in her carefully constructed hell. What began as a physician's prescription for postpartum headaches had transformed into a criminal enterprise that would define every breath, every social interaction, and every moment of maternal love for the rest of her existence. Margaret's story isn't just about one woman's descent into dependency. It's about an entire generation of Victorian ladies who found themselves trapped in a system that promised relief, but delivered only deeper suffering. These women, constrained by social expectations they could never hope to meet without chemical assistance, became unwitting casualties of a medical establishment that prescribed opium as casually as we might recommend aspirin today. The true horror isn't just the physical withdrawal or even the elaborate deceptions required to maintain respectability. It's the gradual erosion of authentic self beneath layers of pharmaceutical performance, until the woman taking laudanum to become a better version of herself discovers that no authentic version remains to recover tonight, as Margaret drifts into laudanum-assisted sleep. While London's criminal networks profit from her desperation, we're reminded that the line between medicine and poison often depends not on the substance itself, but on the society that creates the conditions requiring such desperate solutions. The Victorian woman who sought chemical enhancement of her natural capabilities learned too late that some improvements become the very chains that prevent us from discovering who we might have been without them. In the end, Margaret's midnight salvation represents not victory, but surrender to forces that had been carefully designed to capture women exactly like her. The prescription that promised to make her a better wife and mother had succeeded beyond Dr. Thornbury's wildest imagination, creating someone whose entire existence now revolved around obtaining the very medicine that had stolen her life one measured dose at a time.